Hello there. Thank you for being here tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day still hangs around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling to ancient Mesopotamia, to a document that's puzzled scholars for over a century. A list of kings. Simple enough. Except these kings ruled for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. One king, according to the text, reigned for 43,200 years, another for 36,000 years. The numbers are impossible, are absurd, are the kind of thing that makes you wonder if ancient scribes were making mistakes or recording something else entirely, something we don't quite understand. This isn't mythology exactly, isn't legend. It's presented as history, as the official record of kingship, as the chronicle of who ruled and for how long, but the numbers, those numbers don't make sense, can't make sense, unless something very strange was happening in how the ancient Sumerians understood time, understood kingship, understood their own past. This is the Sumerian king list. Where are you listening from tonight? I wonder what the evening feels like where you are. The document itself is remarkable. Was written on clay tablets in cuneiform script around 2000 BCE, though it describes events supposedly stretching back thousands of years before that. Multiple copies exist, were found in different cities, which means this wasn't obscure text, wasn't fringe belief, was the accepted understanding of Sumerian history, the official version. The chronicle that scribes copied and preserved and passed down through generations, and in this chronicle, before the great flood that Mesopotamians believed destroyed the world, kings ruled for impossibly long periods. After the flood, the reigns get shorter, more reasonable, more human. Eventually, they match historical records we can verify. Kings we know existed, who ruled for normal lifespans, for 20 years, 30 years, the kind of numbers that make sense, but those early kings, those antediluvian rulers, those are the mystery. Are they mythological figures being presented as historical? Are they tribal memories compressed into single reigns? Are they symbolic rather than literal? Or were the Sumerians recording something, some system of measurement, some understanding of kingship that we've lost, that we can't quite grasp because we think about time and rulers differently than they did? The king list raises questions that don't have comfortable answers, challenges our assumptions about how ancient peoples understood their past, about the boundary between history and mythology, about whether that boundary even existed for them, about what happens when a civilization tries to document its origins, tries to trace its legitimacy back to the beginning, tries to connect the present to a past so distant it becomes mythological, even while being recorded as historical fact. If you're inclined, a like or subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this space find others who might need it. Now settle in. Feel whatever's around you. Let your breath slow. Picture southern Iraq, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, 4,000 years ago. The heat is intense, the sky is white with it, and in a scribal school, in one of the great Sumerian cities, a young scribe is copying a text, a list. The list his teacher copied, that his teacher's teacher copied, stretching back generations, the list of kings, the chronicle of who ruled when. His stylus presses into wet clay, makes the wedge-shaped marks, records the names, records the reigns, records the impossible numbers that everyone accepts as true, as the way things were. Before the flood, in the time when the world was different, when kingship came down from heaven, when rulers were closer to gods, when time itself, perhaps, worked differently, or was understood differently, or was recorded in ways we can't quite interpret. The numbers are there, pressed into clay, preserved for 4 millennia, waiting for us to understand them, to make sense of them, to decide what they mean about how the Sumerians saw their world, their history, their relationship to the deep past. The king list is not just ancient document, is window into ancient consciousness, into how a civilization remembered, how it created continuity, how it connected present power structures to mythological origins, how it made sense of time and authority and the legitimacy of rule. The mysteries are layered, are complex, are the kind that don't resolve neatly, but instead open into deeper questions, into broader wonderings about memory and history, and how humans make meaning from the past. Take a breath. The journey begins not with the kings themselves, but with the world that needed to create this list. The Mesopotamian landscape, the cities rising from the floodplain, the civilization that invented writing and immediately used it to record what? History? Mythology? Something between? Something we need to understand before the impossible reign lengths make any sense. Before we can even ask the right questions about what the Sumerian king list is, what it was trying to do, what it reveals about the people who created it and copied it and believed it. The mystery waits, in the clay, in the numbers, in the ancient attempt to trace kingship back to its origins, back to when rulers reigned for thousands upon thousands of years, when the world was young, when gods and humans were closer, when everything, perhaps, was different, or when memory and history merged into something we call mythology, but they called chronicle. The list endures, the mystery deepens, and tonight we'll explore both, patiently, carefully, with the same attention those ancient scribes gave when they pressed their style into clay and recorded the reigns of kings who ruled longer than empires last, longer than civilizations endure, longer than any human could possibly live. The numbers are impossible, but they're there, waiting, preserved, asking us 4,000 years later, what did you mean? What were you recording? What truth were you trying to preserve? Long before anyone pressed stylus into clay, long before cities rose or kings ruled or scribes recorded anything, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates was wild, was untamed, was the meeting place of water and earth in endless negotiation. The rivers flowed then as they flow now, though their courses have shifted over millennia, carrying snowmelt from distant mountains down to the Persian Gulf. The water was brown with silt, was laden with the ground-up mountains, was bringing fertility and destruction both. This was the Fertile Crescent, this narrow arc of arable land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia up to the Mediterranean, and at its heart, in southern Iraq, was the place that would become Sumer, the place that would invent cities, invent writing, invent the king list that records impossible reigns. But first, it was just floodplain, just the place where rivers met sea, just geography waiting for history to begin. The landscape was flat, is flat still. The alluvial plain stretches for hundreds of kilometers, with almost no elevation change, no hills, no natural boundaries, no stone, just the accumulated sediment of eons. The soil is rich, is river deposited, is renewed annually by flooding, but the flatness creates vulnerability, creates exposure. When armies come, there's nowhere to hide. When floods come, there's nowhere to retreat. The geography demands cooperation, demands organization, demands the kind of social structures that eventually become cities, become kingdoms, become the civilizations that need king lists to legitimize their authority. The land shapes what emerges from it, makes certain kinds of culture possible, makes others impossible, and Mesopotamia's geography made irrigation necessary, made surplus possible, made specialization inevitable, made writing essential, made the conditions that would create the first urban civilization. Perhaps 10,000 years ago, when the Ice Age was ending, when sea levels were rising, when the climate was warming, the Persian Gulf was smaller, extended less far inland, the coastline was different, and the people living in this region were hunters, gatherers, mobile groups following game and seasonal plants. They didn't build, didn't settle, didn't create permanent structures, because permanence wasn't useful. The resources they needed moved, so they moved. The stars that guided them were the same stars we see now, the same patterns, the same constellations, but the people who watched them had no cities, no agriculture, no writing, no king lists, just the ancient pattern of following food, of living within natural systems, of being part of the landscape rather than transforming it. When agriculture came, around 10000 BCE, everything changed. Slowly, gradually, over thousands of years, but changed fundamentally. The cultivation of wheat and barley, the domestication of sheep and goats, the discovery that you could plant seeds, tend them, harvest them, store them, that you could create food surplus. That surplus meant you didn't have to move, could build permanent structures, could accumulate possessions, could support people who didn't farm, who specialized, who became priests or craftsmen or soldiers or, eventually, scribes. Agriculture made civilization possible, made it inevitable perhaps, created the conditions that would lead thousands of years later to someone pressing into clay the claim that a king ruled for 43,200 years. The rivers were both blessing and curse. The annual floods brought rich silt, renewed the soil, made agriculture productive, but they were unpredictable. Came early or late, were gentle or destructive. Too much water and crops drowned, too little, and they withered. The unpredictability demanded attention, demanded tracking, demanded the kind of careful observation that leads to calendars, to mathematics, to the systematic recording of patterns. The Mesopotamians became obsessed with time, with cycles, with prediction, with controlling the uncontrollable through knowledge, through documentation, through the careful accumulation of observations across generations. Perhaps that's why they created the king list, why they needed to document who ruled when, why time and authority became intertwined. why legitimacy required genealogy, stretching back to mythological origins. The rivers taught them that survival depends on knowing patterns, on recording, on passing knowledge forward. The king list is many things, but perhaps it's also this: the attempt to control political chaos, the way irrigation controls water chaos, through system, through structure, through the careful documentation of what came before. Take a breath here. Let the landscape settle in your mind. By 6000 BCE, villages were appearing. Small settlements of mud brick houses, clustered along the rivers and canals. The people farmed, fished, raised animals, created pottery, developed tools. The villages grew, connected, traded, and gradually, over millennia, some became towns. The Ubaid period, from about 6500 to 4000 BCE, saw the development of irrigation systems, of temple complexes, of social hierarchies that would eventually become kingship. The air would have smelled of river mud and smoke, of bread baking and animals. The sounds would have been human, voices, children, the splash of water, the scrape of tools. Life was hard but productive, was creating surplus, was building the foundation for what would come next, for the explosion of urbanism, for the invention of writing, for the need to record kings and their reigns, however long those reigns might have been. The stars watched all of this. The same stars, always the same stars, turning slowly overhead as centuries passed, as villages became towns, as simple societies became complex. The constellations that marked seasons for hunters now marked seasons for farmers. The same sky, the same lights, but different meanings, different purposes. The stars were becoming useful in new ways, were being incorporated into calendars, into religious thinking, into the sense that cosmos had order, had pattern, that the heavens moved according to rules that could be learned, could be predicted, could be used. And if the heavens had order, then earth should too, should have kings, should have hierarchy, should have the structure that the king list would eventually document. The connection between celestial order and political order was natural, was obvious to them perhaps. The sky was governed, so earth must be governed. The stars followed patterns, so history must follow patterns. The logic that creates the king list begins here, in the observation of cosmos, in the need for earthly reflection of heavenly organization. The landscape was preparing, was setting the stage. The rivers flowed, the silt accumulated, the villages grew, the population increased. And somewhere in this gradual transformation, someone had an idea, had a vision, had the thought that maybe, just maybe, building bigger would be better. That concentrating people would create power, that organization would create advantage, that cities, those strange unprecedented things, might be possible, might be beneficial, might be the next step. The idea didn't come from nowhere, came from the logic of the landscape, from the demands of irrigation, from the surplus that agriculture created, from the specialization that surplus allowed, from the hierarchies that specialization required. Cities were inevitable, were the outcome of 10,000 years of gradual change, of people learning to farm, to irrigate, to cooperate, to organize, to create the complex social structures that eventually require kings, that require legitimacy, that require chronicles documenting authority stretching back to mythological time, to kings who ruled for thousands of years, to the origins that the king list preserves, or invents, or remembers, or some combination we still don't fully understand. When the first cities were just beginning, when Uruk was still growing, when the idea of kingship was just emerging, there was no writing, no way to record, no way to preserve beyond memory. This was around 4000 BCE, the cusp, the threshold, the moment before everything changed. The cities were there, the temples were there, the hierarchies were developing, but the technology to record, to document, to create permanent external memory, that hadn't been invented yet. Everything depended on oral tradition, on the stories people told, on the genealogies memorized and passed down, on the collective memory that held the past. Imagine what that was like. You know who your grandfather was, your great-grandfather perhaps, maybe 1 or 2 generations before that, if someone told you stories, but beyond that, the past becomes fuzzy, becomes compressed, becomes the time of the ancestors, the time when things were different, the founders, the heroes, the legendary figures who established the clan, the tribe, the village. You know they existed, you know their names perhaps, but how long ago, how many generations? The numbers become uncertain, become approximate, become mythological. This is how oral cultures work, how they preserve the past, not with precision, not with dates, but with names and deeds and the sense of connection to those who came before. Perhaps tribal leadership worked differently then, before formal kingship, before the concentration of power that cities require. The villages had elders, had people who made decisions based on experience, on wisdom, on age, had war leaders who emerged during conflicts, had priests who managed relationships with gods. The authority was distributed, was situational, was based on need and capability, rather than inherited position. This is speculation. We have no written records from this period, but it's reasonable speculation based on how similar societies function, based on the pattern that appears globally when humans organize without centralized states. When someone died, when an elder passed or a leader fell, the community remembered them, told stories about them, incorporated them into tribal history. And those stories, over generations, would change, would merge, would compress. Maybe 3 leaders who ruled consecutively become one leader with a very long life. Maybe a successful dynasty becomes a single legendary founder. Maybe many small conflicts become one great victory. This is how oral tradition works. Preserves the important things, the essence, the meaning, but not necessarily the precise chronology, not necessarily the literal facts. The truth is different, is about identity, about legitimacy, about connecting present to past, about knowing where you come from. The genealogies mattered profoundly. Your lineage was your identity, determined your status, determined your rights, determined your place in the community. And so the genealogies were preserved carefully, were memorized, were passed down. But over many generations, over centuries, the precision fades. The early ancestors become mythological, become the founders, become associated with the gods, become larger than life, because the details are lost, but the importance remains. Perhaps this is what the king list preserves, these compressed genealogies, these tribal memories, these oral traditions that were finally, eventually, written down. And in the writing, the compression becomes visible, becomes the impossible reign lengths, becomes the claim that kings ruled for thousands of years, because oral tradition counted differently, remembered differently, preserved meaning rather than chronology. Take a breath, rest with that possibility. The stars were the calendar, were the only permanent record available. The constellations rose and set in predictable patterns, marked the seasons, told you when to plant, when to harvest, when the floods would come. The sky was knowledge, was the archive, was the place where information was stored permanently, because it never changed. Generation after generation, century after century, the same stars, the same patterns, the same reliability. Perhaps that's why the heavens became associated with the gods, with permanence, with the eternal. And perhaps that's why kingship, when it emerged, claimed connection to heaven, claimed to be lowered from heaven, as the king list says, because kingship needed to be permanent, needed to be eternal, needed to connect to the stars, to the unchanging, to the divine order that governed cosmos. The oral traditions couldn't preserve precision, but they could preserve the claim, the essential claim, that kingship was ancient, was divine, was connected to origins so distant they merged with the mythological time of creation. The psychological need for origin stories is universal, is human. Every culture creates them, tells them, preserves them. The stories explain where we come from, why things are the way they are, why our group is special, why our leaders have authority. The stories aren't lies exactly, aren't deliberate fabrications, are the way humans make meaning, make sense of their existence, connect present to past, create continuity across generations. The oral traditions before writing served this function perfectly, preserved what needed preserving, let go of what didn't matter, created the mythological framework that made social life possible, that made cooperation possible, that made the sacrifices and hierarchies and inequalities of early civilization tolerable because they were part of cosmic order, were the way things had always been, were the way the founders, the legendary kings, the ancient rulers, had established things in the time before memory, in the age when kings ruled for thousands of years, when gods and humans were closer, when the world worked differently, or when memory worked differently, when the boundary between history and mythology didn't exist because no one was writing anything down. No one was creating the permanent record that makes the boundary visible, that makes the impossibility obvious, that makes us ask the questions that oral cultures don't ask, don't need to ask, don't have the technology to ask. Writing changed everything, would change everything, was about to change everything. But for now, in this moment before the invention, the oral traditions were sufficient, were the only option, were the way the past was preserved. And when writing finally came, when scribes finally began recording these traditions, they recorded them faithfully, recorded what had been passed down, recorded the genealogies as they'd been memorized, recorded the reign lengths as oral tradition had preserved them, and those reign lengths, those impossible numbers, those are the fossil, the trace, the evidence of oral tradition's compression of how pre-literate cultures preserve the past. The king list preserves two things simultaneously, preserves the names and sequence of early rulers that might be relatively accurate, and preserves the time scale of oral tradition which isn't accurate at all, which is mythological, which is the residue of generations of memory compressing centuries into single reigns. The writing froze it, made it permanent, made it visible, made it the puzzle we're still trying to solve 4,000 years later. The land was ready, the cities were emerging, the need for legitimacy was growing, the oral traditions existed, and somewhere, someone was about to have an idea that would change human civilization forever. The idea of writing, of external permanent memory, of symbols that could preserve information independent of human minds. The idea was practical at first, was about accounting, about tracking goods, about managing the complexity that cities create. But once the technology existed, once the symbols could be made, once the clay could be pressed and dried and preserved, the uses would expand, would include eventually the recording of kings, of history, of the oral traditions that explained where authority came from, where kingship originated, how long the ancient rulers reigned. The king list was coming, was inevitable once writing existed, was the logical outcome of the need for legitimacy, meeting the technology of documentation, the mysterious chronicle, the impossible numbers, the window into ancient consciousness. All of that was waiting, was about to emerge, as cities grew, as kingship crystallized, as writing developed, as the ancient world, the oral world, the pre-literate world, began its transformation into something new, something that could record, could document, could preserve, could create the mysteries that we study, that we wonder about, that connect us across 4 millennia to the scribes who pressed the king list into clay and believed or knew or accepted or recorded without questioning that kings once ruled for thousands upon thousands of years. When Uruk began to grow, around 4000 BCE, something unprecedented was happening. The settlement was becoming massive, was drawing people from surrounding areas, was concentrating population in ways that had never happened before. By 3500 BCE, Uruk might have held 10,000 people. By 3000 BCE, perhaps 40,000. These numbers are staggering, are almost incomprehensible for the time. Most human settlements were villages of a few hundred, towns of perhaps 1,000, but Uruk was different, was something new, was the world's first true city, and with that urbanization, with that concentration of people, came new problems, new needs, new forms of organization that required invention, required innovation, required technologies that didn't yet exist. The city needed administration, needed to track goods, needed to manage resources, needed to coordinate labor, needed to handle the complexity that size creates. Imagine trying to organize 40,000 people without writing, without any permanent way to record who owns what, who owes what, what's stored where. It's nearly impossible. The human memory can't handle that much information, can't maintain that level of organization. The city was exceeding the capacity of oral culture, was demanding something new, was creating the conditions that made writing necessary, made it inevitable, made it the solution to problems that couldn't be solved any other way. The first writing was boring, was accounting, was temple administrators tracking grain allocations, sheep counts, beer rations. The clay tablets from around 3400 BCE show pictographs, simple drawings representing concrete things, a sheaf of grain, a jar of oil, numbers. The system was practical, was functional, was solving the immediate problem of managing temple resources, but it worked. The symbols could be pressed into clay, the clay could dry, the record could be stored, could be consulted later, could outlast human memory, could create institutional continuity across generations. The technology was revolutionary, even when the content was mundane. Perhaps the scribes who invented this system didn't realize what they were creating, didn't foresee that the symbols for grain and sheep would evolve into full language, would become capable of recording anything, would eventually preserve the king list with its impossible reign lengths, would make history possible, would create the boundary between prehistory and history, between the oral past and the documented past. The invention happened gradually, took centuries. The pictographs became more abstract, became cuneiform, the wedge-shaped marks made by pressing a reed stylus into wet clay. The system expanded, could represent sounds, could write names, could write complex ideas, could write anything. By 2500 BCE, Sumerian literature existed: poetry, mythology, wisdom texts, and eventually chronicles, records of kings, the official versions of history that political power requires. Take a breath. Feel the weight of that invention. With cities came kingship. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually. The early cities might have been governed by councils, by priest-kings, by collective leadership. But as competition increased, as warfare became common, as cities struggled with each other for resources and dominance, centralized authority became advantageous, became necessary. A single leader who could make decisions quickly, who could command in war, who could organize defense, who could coordinate large-scale projects. The role emerged from need, from the logic of urban life, from the dynamics of competition. And once the role existed, it needed legitimacy, needed justification, needed explanation for why one person should have such power, why everyone else should obey, why the hierarchy should exist. The answer was divine sanction, was the claim that kingship came from the gods, that the king was chosen by heaven, that his authority was cosmic, not just social. The king list expresses this explicitly, opens with the line, "When kingship was lowered from heaven." The metaphor is clear. Kingship is not human invention, is divine gift, is the way the gods organized human society, is part of cosmic order. The king is not just powerful man, is the god's representative, is the mediator between heaven and earth, is sacred. This theology solves the legitimacy problem, makes rebellion not just against the king but against the gods, makes hierarchy divine, makes obedience religious duty. The ideology was powerful, was effective, was the foundation of political authority for millennia. But divine sanction required genealogy, required proving connection to the divine origins, required showing that your kingship, your dynasty, your city's claim to rule goes back to the beginning, goes back to when the gods first lowered kingship from heaven, goes back to the legendary rulers, the founders, the ancient kings who were closer to gods, who ruled in the mythological time, who reigned according to the oral traditions now being written down for thousands upon thousands of years. The king list serves this purpose, provides the genealogy, traces current rulers back to divine origins, creates continuity, creates legitimacy, makes the present monarchy part of ancient cosmic pattern. The impossible reign lengths aren't problem for this purpose, are actually advantage. Make the origins more distant, more sacred, more unquestionably divine, more beyond normal human questioning. The numbers create awe, create mystery, create the sense that ancient times were fundamentally different, that kings then were closer to gods, that the connection to heaven was real in ways that have diminished but not disappeared. The writing and the kingship and the cities all emerged together, were interconnected, were part of the same transformation, the same moment when human society became something new, when the villages became urban civilization, when oral culture became literate culture, when tribal leadership became divine kingship, when the past became something you could write down, preserve, study, argue about. The transformation happened in Mesopotamia first, happened in southern Iraq, in the cities along the Tigris and Euphrates, in Uruk and Ur and Eridu and Kish, in the places that would be listed in the king list as the cities where kingship resided, where it moved from one to another as dynasties rose and fell, as wars determined which city dominated, as the political landscape shifted. But through all the changes, the need remained, the need for legitimacy, the need to prove that current rulers were heirs to ancient tradition, were part of unbroken chain, were connected to the origins, to the time when kingship was first lowered from heaven, to the kings who ruled for impossible spans, to the beginning. The stars still shone, still marked the seasons, still provided the calendar that agriculture and ritual required. But now there was competition, now there were clay tablets, now there was writing that could preserve what stars couldn't, could record the specific, the temporary, the human events that cosmic cycles couldn't capture. The stars marked eternal time, the tablets marked historical time, and between them, in the gap between eternal and historical, that's where the king list lives, recording both, recording the eternal mythological time when kings ruled forever, and recording the historical time when kings ruled normal lifespans, recording the transition, recording the moment when gods and humans separated, when divine time became human time, when the impossible became possible, when mythology became history, when the king list became necessary, became inevitable, became the document that would preserve the mystery we're still exploring, the question we're still asking, the numbers we're still trying to understand, the chronicle of kings, the impossible reigns, the connection between present and past, between human and divine, between history and mythology, between what was written and what was true, between the clay tablets that survive and the oral traditions they preserved, between the scribes who recorded and the audiences who believed, between ancient Mesopotamia and us. Listening now, 4 millennia later, still wondering, still asking, still trying to make sense of kings who ruled for thousands of years, of the list that records them, of the civilization that created both. When archaeologists first excavated Nippur, in what is now central Iraq, in the early years of the 20th century, they found clay tablets, thousands of them, tens of thousands. The ancient city had been a religious center, a place of scribal schools, a repository of knowledge, and buried in the ruins, in the layers of collapsed buildings and accumulated earth, were the records, the libraries, the archives that preserved Mesopotamian thought. The excavation began in 1889 under the University of Pennsylvania, continued for decades, was one of the most important archaeological projects in Mesopotamian history, and among the thousands of tablets, among the mundane accounts and the religious texts and the literary works, was something unusual, something that would puzzle scholars for over a century, a list of kings, with impossible reign lengths. The first fragments were found in 1906, small pieces of clay, broken, incomplete, but recognizable as chronicle, as official record. The tablets were small enough to hold in your hand. The clay was pale, was sun-baked, was pressed with cuneiform script, so fine that reading it required close attention, careful study. The wedge-shaped marks were clear, were deliberate, were the work of trained scribes who had spent years learning the complex system of signs. The tablets were catalogued, photographed, sent to museums where Assyriologists, scholars who could read ancient cuneiform, began the slow work of translation. What they read was confusing, was a list, kings' names, cities, reign lengths, but the numbers, those numbers didn't make sense. Kings ruling for 28,800 years, for 36,000 years, for 43,200 years. The initial reaction was dismissal, was assumption of error. Perhaps the scribes had made mistakes. Perhaps the numbers were symbolic. Perhaps this was mythology, not history. Perhaps it wasn't meant to be taken literally. But as more fragments were found, as more copies of the same text emerged from different sites, the pattern became clear. This wasn't error, wasn't isolated text, was the standard Mesopotamian understanding of their own history, was the official chronicle, was copied and preserved across multiple cities for over 1,000 years. The most complete version was found later, the Weld Blundell prism, discovered in 1922, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's a clay prism, 4-sided, about 8 inches tall. Each side is covered with cuneiform script, tiny careful marks. The object is beautiful in its way, is precise, is the work of someone who cared about accuracy, about preserving the text exactly. The prism lists all the kings, from the beginning, from when kingship was lowered from heaven, through the antediluvian period, through the flood, through the dynasties that followed, and at the end, the kings are historical, are verified by other sources, are rulers we know existed. The progression is clear, is undeniable. From mythology to history, from impossible to possible, from the ancient time to the historical present, all in one document. Perhaps the most striking thing is the multiplicity of copies. The king list wasn't obscure text, wasn't fringe belief. Multiple versions have been found, in Nippur, in in Izin, in other Mesopotamian cities. The copies differ in details, include different dynasties, emphasize different cities, but the core structure is the same. The antediluvian kings, the flood, the gradual shortening of reigns, the transition to verifiable history. This was the accepted understanding, was what every educated person in Mesopotamia learned, was taught in scribal schools, was copied as training exercise, was the foundation of historical consciousness. The multiplicity proves this wasn't isolated mythology, was mainstream, was official, was the way an entire civilization understood its past. Take a breath here, let that significance settle. The archaeological context matters. These tablets weren't found in temples, weren't religious texts hidden in sacred spaces, were found in scribal schools, in administrative archives. In the contexts of daily bureaucratic life, the king list was practical document, was reference material, was the chronicle you consulted when you needed to know who ruled when you needed to establish chronology, when you needed to prove your city's claim to kingship. The location of discovery tells us this was working document, was used document, was the history that Mesopotamian administrators and priests and scholars relied on. The impossibility of the numbers didn't make it mythological in their minds, made it ancient, made it sacred, made it the record of the time when things were different, when gods and humans were closer, when the world worked by different rules. Modern scholars initially tried to explain away the numbers, proposed that different measurement systems had been used, that year meant something different in ancient times, that the numbers were symbolic, represented dynasties rather than individuals, that scribal errors had compounded over generations of copying, that this was never meant to be taken literally. But none of these explanations quite work. The mathematics is too precise, the progression too deliberate, the correlation with other sources too consistent. At some point, the scholarly consensus shifted, accepted that the Sumerians recorded what they believed, recorded their oral traditions faithfully, recorded the genealogies and reign lengths that had been passed down. The numbers are impossible, but they're not mistakes, are something else. Are the trace of pre-literate memory, are how oral culture preserves deep time, are the compression that happens when centuries of tribal history become chronicle. What we're left with is mystery, not about the document's authenticity, that's certain, not about its importance, that's obvious, but about interpretation, about what these numbers meant to the people who wrote them, about how they understood their own past, about the boundary between history and mythology in ancient consciousness. The king list exists, is real, is preserved. We can read it, can study it, can trace its transmission across 1,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, but we can't quite grasp what it meant, can't fully enter the mindset that accepts 43 200-year reigns as historical fact, can't reconstruct the cognitive framework that makes such numbers meaningful. The gap between their understanding and ours is profound, is maybe unbridgeable. The document survives, but the consciousness that created it, that's lost, that's what we're trying to recover, trying to understand, trying to glimpse through the careful cuneiform marks pressed into clay 4,000 years ago by scribes who believed, or knew, or recorded without questioning, that kings once ruled for thousands upon thousands of years. When you actually look at the king list, when you read the translated text, the structure is clear, is methodical, is organized. The document opens with a statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This is the beginning, the origin point. Eridu was the most ancient city according to Sumerian tradition, was the first place where gods taught human civilization, where Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, established his temple. The king list places the first king there, Alulim, and states his reign, 28,800 years. The number is precise, is specific, is not approximation, is recorded as fact. The next king is Al-Aljar, in Eridu still, his reign 36,000 years. Then the kingship moves to Bad Tibira, another ancient city. 5 kings rule there. Enman-Luana rules for 43,200 years, Enman-Galana for 28,800 years, the divine shepherd Dumuzid for 36,000 years. The numbers are enormous, are impossible, but they follow patterns, are multiples of 3,600, are calculated using the Sumerian base 60 mathematical system. The precision suggests intentionality, suggests these aren't random exaggerations, aren't scribal errors, are deliberate numbers following mathematical logic we can recognize even if we can't understand why they were chosen. The kingship continues moving, to Larag, to Sippar, to Shuruppak, 8 cities total before the flood. 8 kings ruling for a combined 241,200 years. The cities are real, have been excavated, have archaeological remains, have temples and ziggurats and settlement layers going back to the Ubaid period. The geography is accurate, the sequence of cultural importance matches what archaeology shows, but the timeline, that's mythological, that's impossible. That's where history and mythology merge into something we don't quite have categories for. The cities are real, but the time scale is imaginary, or symbolic, or compressed, or something else we haven't figured out. Perhaps the most important line comes next. Then the flood swept over. Just that. Simple statement, understated, but marking cosmic division, separating what came before from what came after. The flood is central to Mesopotamian mythology, appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In other texts, is the catastrophe that destroyed the old world, that required humanity to begin again, that reset everything. Archaeological evidence shows flood layers at various Mesopotamian sites, but not universal flood, not single event that matches the mythology. The floods were local, were regional, were the kind of devastating but limited disasters that rivers in floodplains create regularly. The mythological flood might preserve memory of actual flooding, might be many floods compressed into one story, might be purely symbolic, representing the transition from mythological to historical time. We don't know. The archaeology doesn't provide clear answer. After the flood, kingship begins again. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven. The kingship was in Kish. Notice the repetition. Kingship descends from heaven again, is re-established. The divine sanction is renewed, and the numbers change, are still impossibly long, but less impossibly long. The first king of Kish, Gar, rules for 1,200 years, still impossible, still mythological, but smaller, more modest. The progression continues, the dynasties are listed. First dynasty of Uk, Kish. First dynasty of Uk. First dynasty of U. The reign lengths gradually decrease, drop from thousands of years to hundreds, from hundreds to decades, until eventually, around 2600 BCE, the numbers become historically plausible, become verifiable through other sources, become the history we can trust rather than the mythology we can't. Take a breath. Rest with those numbers. The mathematical precision is striking. The antediluvian reigns are all multiples of 3,600. That number, 3,600, was called a Shah in Sumerian, was a fundamental unit in their base 60 number system, was significant, was perfect, was divine perhaps. The early kings rule for 8 Shah, 10 Shah, 12 Shah. The pattern is deliberate, is showing calculation, is suggesting that whoever created these numbers was using mathematical principles, was working within a system, was not randomly inventing. Some scholars suggest the Shah might have represented something other than years, might have meant dynasty, or generation, or some other unit we don't recognize. If you divide 28,800 by 60, you get 480. If you divide by 3,600, you get 8. Perhaps these are the real numbers. Perhaps the multiplication happened through miscommunication, through the translation of oral tradition into written record, through some systematic conversion we don't understand. Perhaps, but even these smaller numbers are too large. 480 years is still impossible reign. The mathematics doesn't solve the problem, just makes it different. Another interpretation focuses on astronomical cycles. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, creates a cycle of about 25,920 years. The Mesopotamians were sophisticated astronomers, tracked celestial movements carefully. Perhaps the king list is encoding astronomical knowledge. Perhaps the numbers represent something celestial rather than terrestrial. Perhaps the reign of early kings is metaphor for astronomical periods, for the movement of stars or planets or constellations. The idea is speculative, has adherents, but lacks clear evidence. The text doesn't present itself as astronomy, presents itself as king list, as chronicle, as political history. Reading it as encoded astronomy requires assumptions we can't verify, requires believing the Mesopotamians were being deliberately obscure or hiding knowledge in plain sight. Possible, but unprovable. What remains certain is the progression, from impossible to possible, from mythological to historical. The king list bridges them, contains both, starts with kings who rule for tens of thousands of years, ends with kings who rule for tens of years. The transition is gradual, is documented, is the trace of oral tradition becoming written history. The early kings might be tribal memories, might be dynasties compressed into individuals, might be purely mythological, serving political, rather than historical purposes. The later kings are real, are verified, are the rulers we can trace through multiple sources, and in between, somewhere in that middle ground, mythology becomes history, legend becomes chronicle, the impossible becomes possible. The king list preserves the transition, makes it visible, makes it the puzzle that connects ancient Mesopotamian consciousness to our attempts to understand it. The numbers are there, pressed into clay, permanent, unchanging, waiting for us to decode them, waiting for us to understand what they meant, what they represented, what truth they were trying to preserve. The mystery is complete, is total, is the gap between their understanding and ours, between the consciousness that could accept these numbers and the consciousness that can't, between the ancient world and the modern world, between the clay and the questions, between what was written and what was meant. The king list waits, patient as the clay it's written on, silent as the centuries between then and now, mysterious as the kings it records, who ruled longer than any human has ever lived. Let me tell you about the day, about a day that never happened but was remembered anyway, about the day the flood came, about the catastrophe that divided time, that made everything before it ancient, mythological, different, that made everything after it history, human, recoverable. The Mesopotamians preserved multiple accounts. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes flood narrative. The Atrahasis epic describes it, and the king list marks it. Simply, starkly. Then the flood swept over. Those words divide the impossible rains from the gradually normalizing rains, divide the antediluvian kings from the post-flood dynasties, divide mythological time from historical time. The flood is the hinge, the pivot, the moment that explains why numbers change, why the world became different, why we can't access what came before except through these strange impossible chronicles. Imagine the world before, the 8 cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larag, Sippar, Shuruppak, the others, ruled by kings whose reigns stretched across tens of thousands of years. This is mythological world, primordial world, the time when gods and humans were closer, when immortality was possible, when the rules were different. The texts describe this time with longing, with nostalgia, with the sense that something was lost, something precious, something that can't be recovered. The world before the flood was better somehow, was purer, was closer to divine intention, was what the gods wanted before humanity disappointed them, before the decision was made to destroy and begin again. The reason for the flood varies in different accounts. In some, humanity had become too numerous, too noisy. The gods couldn't sleep, couldn't find peace. In others, humans had become wicked, had corrupted themselves, had broken divine laws. The justifications differ, but the outcome is the same. The gods, meeting in divine council, decide to destroy humanity, to send flood, to wipe the earth clean, to start over. The decision is unanimous, almost unanimous. Enki, god of wisdom, god of fresh water, god who favors humanity, objects, decides to save someone, chooses Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Atrahasis in the Akkadian, Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh. The name changes but the role is constant. The survivor, the one who builds the boat, who loads his family and animals, who endures the deluge, who preserves life, who becomes ancestor of all who come after. The flood itself is described with terror, with awe. The rain falls, falls without stopping. The rivers overflow, the dikes break, the irrigation channels become torrents, the water rises, covers the fields, reaches the city walls, breaches them, floods the streets. The people flee to rooftops, to high ground. But there is no high ground, not in Mesopotamia. The land is flat, the water is everywhere. The gods themselves are frightened, huddle like humans, regret their decision, weep at the destruction. The texts don't shy from the horror, from the wholesale annihilation, from the death of everything. The flood lasts 7 days, 7 nights. Biblical number, sacred number, complete number, and when it ends, when the waters recede, only the boat remains, only the survivor, only the seed from which humanity will regrow. Take a breath here. Feel that devastation. But here's the question. Did it happen? Was there a great flood? Archaeology provides ambiguous answer, provides partial answer, provides evidence of flooding, but not the flood, not the universal catastrophe, not the world-ending deluge. The excavations at Ur, conducted by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, found a flood layer, a thick deposit of clean water-laid clay, separating earlier occupation from later occupation. Woolley initially thought he'd found the flood, the biblical flood, the Mesopotamian flood, the mythological event made real, but further excavation complicated the picture. The flood layer at Ur doesn't match flood layers at other sites. The dating is different, the depth varies, the evidence suggests multiple floods, multiple local catastrophes, multiple disasters that affected different cities at different times. Not one universal flood, but many regional floods, the kind that river civilizations experience, that floodplains create, that are devastating, but not world-ending. Perhaps the mythology preserves compressed memory. Perhaps many floods, over many centuries, became one flood in the retelling, became the flood that separated epochs, that divided time, that explained why the antediluvian world, the world of impossibly long reigns, gave way to historical world, the world we can document, the world we can understand. The flood becomes explanation, becomes the event that justifies the change, that makes the transition comprehensible, that answers the question, why don't kings rule for 43,200 years anymore? Because the flood happened, because the world changed, because the connection between heaven and earth was altered, because humanity lost something in the catastrophe, lost the closeness to gods, lost the special nature that made those long reigns possible, lost the primordial blessing. The flood explains everything, makes the impossible past acceptable, makes the historical present inevitable. Or perhaps the flood is purely mythological, is narrative device, is the structure that king lists require. Many ancient cultures use flood narratives, use catastrophes to divide mythological time from historical time. The pattern is nearly universal. The Bible has Noah, Hindu traditions have Manu, Greek mythology has Deucalion. The flood divides, separates, creates before and after, makes origin stories possible, makes the transition from creation to history narratively satisfying. Perhaps the Mesopotamian flood serves this function, is not memory of real event, but mythological necessity, is the story that makes the king list work, that justifies its structure, that explains its numbers, that bridges impossible to possible without requiring belief in impossible. Whatever the truth, and we may never know the truth, the flood works in the king list, works perfectly, divides the document into sections. Before flood, impossible reigns. After flood, gradually normalizing reigns. The logic is clear, is elegant, is the structure that makes the list comprehensible, that makes it usable, that makes it serve its purpose of connecting present rulers to divine origins while acknowledging that present rulers are, well, normal, are human, are subject to human limitations. The flood explains the change, absolves present rulers of inadequacy. You don't rule for 43,200 years, not because you're insufficient, but because the world changed, because the flood altered everything, because the antediluvian conditions, whatever those were, no longer exist. The theology protects, the mythology serves. The flood makes everything make sense within the framework that the king list creates. The text moves on quickly. After the simple statement, then the flood swept over, it continues. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Life continues. Civilization rebuilds. Kingship is re-established. The gods haven't abandoned humanity, have renewed the covenant, have lowered kingship from heaven again. The cities are different now. Kish wasn't antediluvian capital, his new beginning, his fresh start, and the reigns, while still impossible, are less impossible, are on path toward historical plausibility, toward the numbers that will eventually match other sources, match archaeology, match reality. The flood is the turning point, is the explanation, is the event real or mythological or both, that makes the king list possible, that makes its structure logical, that makes its progression from mythology to history acceptable, that makes us wonder, even now, 4,000 years later, whether something actually happened, whether memory actually preserves, whether the flood, in some form, in some way, really marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. The question remains. The mystery endures, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the flood's truth isn't in historicity, but in meaning, in the way it structures understanding, in the way it connects ancient peoples to their own deep past, in the way it makes the king list, with all its impossibilities, into coherent chronicle, into document that served for 1,000 years as the official history, into the mystery we're still exploring, still questioning, still wondering about as we trace the impossible reigns from before the flood into the gradually historical reigns that came after, when kingship descended from heaven again, when humanity began again, when the world became the world we can recognize, the world we can document, the world where kings rule for years instead of millennia, where history becomes possible, where the king list transitions from mythology to chronicle, from impossible to verified, from ancient wonder to accessible past, when kingship descended from heaven the second time, when the world was remade after the flood, it came to Kish, not to Eridu, not to the ancient cities that ruled before, but to Kish, a city in northern Babylonia, about 12 kilometers east of where Babylon would eventually stand. The choice is significant, is the statement that this is new beginning, fresh start, the antediluvian world is gone, the impossible reigns are finished, now comes something different, still extraordinary, still touched by divine, but more human, more accessible, more connected to the world we can document and understand. The king list records 23 kings in the first dynasty of Kish, ruling for a combined 24,510 years and 3 months. The precision is remarkable, not just 24,510 years but 3 additional months. The detail suggests care, suggests these numbers mattered, were calculated, were important enough to preserve exactly, but the numbers are still impossible, still beyond any human lifespan, still mythological by our standards, yet they're smaller. The first king, Gar, rules for 1,200 years. Compare that to Ululim's 28,800. Compare to Enmenluana's 43,200. The scale has changed, has become less cosmic, less divine, more, almost, human. The progression has begun, the movement from mythology toward history, from the time of gods toward the time of mortals. Kish marks the transition point, marks where the journey starts. Perhaps the most famous king of Kish is Etana, listed as 13th ruler. His reign, 1,560 years. Still impossible. But Etana appears in other texts, in mythology, in legend, is more than just name and list. The Epic of Etana describes him as shepherd, as the one who stabilized all lands, as the king who rode an eagle to heaven seeking the plant of birth. The story is fantastical, is clearly mythological, but it makes Etana real, in a way the earlier kings aren't. Makes him character, makes him subject of stories that were told and retold, that mattered enough to preserve in multiple forms. Etana Bridges is listed in the king list as historical king, is celebrated in epic as legendary hero, is both, is the kind of figure that exists at boundary between mythology and history, where the two merge, where we can't quite separate fact from fiction because the culture that created him didn't separate them, didn't need to, didn't have the categories that would make separation necessary. The city of Kish itself has been excavated, has archaeological remains, temples, palaces, fortifications, evidence of prosperity and power in the early dynastic period, around 2900 to 2500 BCE. The timing matches roughly with when the king list places the first dynasty. The correlation isn't perfect. The archaeology doesn't verify individual kings, but it confirms that Kish was important, was powerful, was the kind of city that could claim dominance, could claim kingship, could be listed first in the post-flood sequence. The material culture shows sophistication, shows trade connections, shows the kind of organized society that kingship requires, that makes dynastic rule possible, that creates the need for chronicles like the king list to legitimize authority and preserve succession. Imagine standing in Kish around 2700 BCE. The city walls rise from the plain, mud brick, massive, protecting tens of thousands of people. The streets are narrow, are dusty, are crowded with life, markets, workshops, the smell of bread and beer and animals, the sound of voices in Sumerian. In other languages too, trade brings diversity, brings people from other cities, other regions. The temple dominates, rises above everything else, is the center, is where the gods dwell, where the priests mediate between human and divine, where offerings are made, where rituals maintain cosmic order, and somewhere in the palace, the king sits, traces his lineage back through the dynasties, back through the flood, back to when kingship first descended from heaven. His authority comes from that continuity, from that connection, from the fact that he's heir to Etana, to Gaua, to the divine origins that the king list documents. Take a breath, feel that power. But Kish would not remain dominant forever. The king list itself documents this. After the first dynasty of Kish comes the first dynasty of Uruk, then back to Kish, then to Uruk, then to Awan, then to Hamazi. The kingship moves, shifts from city to city, sometimes through conquest, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through circumstances the texts don't explain. The movement creates narrative, creates the structure that makes the king list more than just genealogy, makes it chronicle of power, of rise and fall, of the eternal competition between cities, between dynasties, between the ambitions that drive kings to expand and defend and legitimize and pass authority to sons who might or might not maintain what fathers built. The story is political, is about authority and legitimacy and the eternal human question, who should rule? The king list provides answer, provides the official version, then this is how kingship moved, this is the order, this is the legitimacy that current rulers claim, that current city bases its authority on. The reigns continue decreasing. Not uniformly, not without exception. But the trend is clear. The first dynasty of Kish averages about 1,065 years per king. Impossible still, but compared to the antediluvian average of 30,150 years, the scale has shifted dramatically, and as the king list continues, as it moves through dynasties and cities, the numbers keep dropping. 800 years, 600, 400, gradually approaching the realm of possibility, gradually becoming the kind of numbers that historical kings might, with exaggeration, claim. The progression is the document's most striking feature, is the evidence that this isn't random mythology, is structured narrative, is documenting transition, is preserving the memory, or the claim, or the belief that kingship came from gods but became human, that the connection between heaven and earth weakened, that the world changed, that what was possible in mythological time became impossible in historical time, that we live in diminished age, an age still ruled by kings, still structured by divine authority. but an age where kings die, where reigns end, where mortality is inescapable, where the 43 200-year reigns are gone forever, lost with the antediluvian world, lost with whatever that world was, lost in the flood, lost in the transition that Kish marks, lost in the movement from impossible to possible that the king list traces with its gradually shrinking numbers and its patient documentation of dynasty after dynasty moving through time toward the moment when the numbers finally match history, finally become verifiable, finally become the chronicle we can trust because it aligns with other sources, with archaeology, with the past we can actually recover rather than the past we can only imagine, through these strange, beautiful, mysterious, impossible numbers pressed into clay by scribes who believed them, who recorded them, who passed them forward for us to wonder about 4,000 years later. When you reach the first dynasty of Uruk in the king list, when you trace the succession down through the dynasties, you encounter a name that's famous, that's legendary, that appears in literature and mythology and popular imagination, Gilgamesh, the hero, the king who sought immortality, the protagonist of humanity's oldest surviving epic. He's there, in the king list, listed as 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty. His reign, 126 years. The number is still impossible, is still mythological. No human lives 126 years, but compare it to the earlier numbers. Compare to Ululim's 28,800. Compare even to Gower's 1,200. Gilgamesh's reign is approaching something almost reasonable, almost believable. The number is dropping, is moving toward the historical, toward the possible. And Gilgamesh himself, he might have been real. The Epic of Gilgamesh is literature, is one of the great works of ancient world, describes the king's adventures, his friendship with Enkidu, his grief at Enkidu's death, his quest for immortality, his journey to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, his eventual acceptance that death is inevitable, that immortality is reserved for gods, that being human means being mortal. The epic is profound, is moving, is the meditation on mortality that every culture needs, that every person faces. The story was popular, was copied across Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years, was translated into other languages, was known in Hittite lands, in Assyria, in Babylon. Gilgamesh was cultural icon, was the hero everyone knew, was the figure that represented both human greatness and human limitation. But was he real? The epic is clearly mythological, contains impossibilities, contains gods intervening, contains monsters, contains the journey to the edge of the world, contains elements that are obviously literary invention, obviously fantastical, but at the core, at the center of the elaborate mythology, might be a real king, a real ruler of Uruk, who lived around 2700 BCE, who did something impressive, something memorable, something that made him legendary, something that subsequent generations elaborated into epic, into the story that survives. The king list suggests this possibility, treats Gilgamesh as historical king, places him in sequence, gives him reign length, includes him in the chronicle of legitimate rulers, makes him part of the unbroken line of kingship, stretching back to divine origins. Archaeological evidence is suggestive. Uruk in the early dynastic period was enormous, was one of the great cities of its time, had massive walls. The epic attributes these walls to Gilgamesh, describes him as builder, as the one who fortified the city, as the one who made Uruk great. Excavations show that Uruk did have impressive walls, did have monumental architecture, did have the kind of construction projects that require powerful leadership, require kingship, require organization and resources and vision. Whether Gilgamesh specifically built them, we can't know, but someone did. Some king or kings invested enormous effort in making Uruk powerful, making it secure, making it worthy of being listed in the king list as holder of kingship, as center of legitimate authority. Perhaps what makes Gilgamesh fascinating is the blurring, the impossibility of separating the historical from the legendary. He appears in the king list as king, appears in the epic as hero, appears in other texts as demigod, as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, as someone special, someone different, someone who transcends normal human limitations, even while ultimately being subject to human mortality. The characterization might reflect reality, might reflect how exceptional kings were remembered, were elevated, were given mythological attributes, because their achievements seemed superhuman, because leading thousands, building massive walls, creating lasting institutions, shaping civilization, those things seem godlike, seem to require more than ordinary human capacity. So the king becomes demigod in memory, becomes legend, becomes myth, while remaining, at some level, historically grounded, based on someone who actually lived, who actually ruled, who actually did things impressive enough to be remembered for 4,000 years. Take a breath here. Rest with that mystery. Imagine Gilgamesh ruling Uruk around 2700 BCE. He's middle-aged, perhaps, has ruled for decades, has built the walls, has established his authority, has made Uruk powerful through military campaigns and clever alliances, and the kind of political skill that kingship requires. He knows he's mortal, knows his reign will end, knows that despite the king list claiming 126 years, he'll be lucky to reach 50, 60 if fortune favours. The number in the list isn't literal, can't be literal, is mythological elaboration, is the way subsequent generations honoured him, stretched his reign, made him seem more impressive, more divine, more connected to the ancient kings who ruled for thousands of years. The exaggeration is tribute, is respect, is the way memory works. The greater the king, the longer the reign in later accounts. The more impressive the achievements, the more mythological the attributes. The process is natural, is how oral tradition functions, how legendary figures emerge, how history becomes mythology, even while remaining somewhere at the core, historical. The stars that watch Uruk's walls, those stars are the same, haven't changed. The constellations Gilgamesh knew are the ones we see, the same patterns, the same lights, but the meanings have shifted. For Gilgamesh, if he existed, the stars were gods, were divine beings watching human affairs, were part of the cosmic order that kingship reflected. His authority came from heaven, as the king list said all kingship did. His legitimacy was celestial, was part of pattern written in stars. We see the same stars and think differently, think astronomically, think scientifically, think about light years and nuclear fusion and the physics of stellar evolution. The gap between his understanding and ours is profound, is maybe unbridgeable, but the stars remain the constant, remain the witnesses to both his world and ours, to both his understanding and ours, to the long arc of human civilization that stretches from his time to our time, with the king list as one of the bridges, one of the connections, one of the documents that preserves him, however mythologized, however impossible his 126-year reign, however legendary his adventures, preserves him as part of the chronicle, part of the official history, part of the sequence of kings that connects ancient Sumerians to their divine origins and provides us, 4,000 years later, with the fascinating puzzle of where history ends and mythology begins, where the real Gilgamesh, if he existed, becomes the legendary Gilgamesh, becomes the hero, becomes the figure who lives not for 126 years but forever, in the epic, in the cultural memory, in the enduring human fascination with heroes who achieved greatness but could not escape death, who were mighty but mortal, who were remembered, who were honoured, who were given impossible reign lengths in king lists, because the real number, the actual years they ruled, seemed insufficient to capture their significance, seemed too small to represent their impact. So the numbers grew, in oral tradition, in the memory, in the copying and recopying that eventually fixed them in clay as 126 years, as the number that makes Gilgamesh both historical and mythological, both real and legendary, both king and hero, both mortal and immortal, both in the king list as historical ruler and in the epic as eternal figure. The blurring is complete, is perfect, is what makes him endure. Let me tell you about a day 4,000 years ago, about a boy named Nabi Elishu. The name means "my God has come to me." Whether anyone was actually called this, we don't know, but it's the kind of name that was common, that Sumerian families gave their sons, that marked them as dedicated to the gods. Nabi Elishu was 12 years old, was student in the scribal school in Nippur, had been training since he was 8, 4 years of learning to press stylus into clay, learning to make the wedge-shaped marks, learning to read, learning to write, learning the hundreds of cuneiform signs, learning the system that made civilization possible, that made the king list possible. The day begins early, before the heat becomes unbearable. Nabi Elishu wakes in his family's house, washes, eats bread and dates, drinks beer, the weak beer that everyone drinks because water is often unsafe. His father is merchant, is wealthy enough to afford scribal training for his son. Scribes have status, have secure employment, work for temples or palaces or wealthy merchants who need record keeping. The investment in education is significant, takes years, costs money, but produces valuable skill, produces literacy, produces the kind of expertise that ensures good life, that creates opportunity, that makes Nabi Elishu's future secure if he completes the training, if he becomes full scribe, if he masters the complex system. The walk to school is short, The school is attached to temple complex, is where the educated elite are trained, where the knowledge is preserved, where young boys learn the traditions, learn the texts, learn to reproduce the documents that Sumerian civilization depends on. Nabi Elishu carries his tablet, a fresh clay tablet, soft, ready to be inscribed. The tablet is rectangular, fits in his hands, is the surface where he'll practice today's lesson, where he'll make his marks, where his teacher will correct him, where he'll repeat the signs over and over until muscle memory takes over, until his hand knows what his mind is learning, until the cuneiform becomes natural, automatic, perfect. The classroom is simple. Open courtyard, shade structure protecting from direct sun, benches where students sit, the teacher at the front, an older scribe, someone who spent decades mastering the craft, who knows not just how to write, but what to write, who has memorized texts, who can recite poetry and mathematics and legal formulas, who embodies the tradition, who passes it forward, who makes the next generation of scribes possible. The teacher is patient but demanding. Mistakes are noted, are corrected. The students are expected to achieve precision, accuracy. The marks must be clean, must be correct, must match the established forms that all scribes use, that make documents readable across cities, across generations, that create the standardization that written communication requires. Today's lesson is the king list. Not the whole list, just a section, just the beginning. The antediluvian kings. The teacher recites, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. The students repeat, memorizing, learning the text by heart. This is how it's done, how texts are preserved. Through memorization first, through understanding the content, through being able to recite it. Writing comes second, is the record of what's already internalized, what's already known. The students chant the names, the cities, the reign lengths, the impossible numbers. They don't question them, don't wonder if they're literally true, don't have the framework that would make questioning occur. This is the tradition. This is what happened. This is the official history. This is what scribes must know. Take a breath. Feel that transmission. After recitation comes copying. Nabi Elishu presses his stylus into the soft clay, makes the first mark, the wedge that starts kingship. The sign is complex, is combination of simpler elements. His hand follows the pattern he's been practicing for 4 years. The mark is clear, is precise, is correct. He continues, building the signs, creating the cuneiform text, copying from the master tablet his teacher has provided. The tablet shows the correct forms, shows what the finished work should look like. Nabi Elishu compares, checks, makes adjustments. His goal is perfection, is producing copy that's indistinguishable from the master, that preserves the text exactly, that carries forward the tradition without alteration, without error, without introducing variants that could corrupt the chronicle. The work is slow, is meditative, is the focus that craftsmanship requires. Each sign must be perfect, each line must be straight, each column must be aligned. The clay is forgiving. Mistakes can be smoothed away, can be corrected, but the goal is to not make mistakes, is to achieve such mastery that errors don't occur, that the hand moves correctly automatically, that the mind and hand work together seamlessly, that writing becomes as natural as speech. This is years away for Nabi Elishu. Will take another 4 years perhaps, another 8. Depends on his aptitude, on his dedication, on how much he wants to become full scribe, to join the elite, to be the one who writes the documents, who keeps the records, who preserves the king list and all the other texts that civilization requires. By midday the lesson is done. The tablets are set aside to dry, will be kept if they're good, will be destroyed and the clay recycled if they're not. Most practice tablets don't survive, are broken down, are made into new tablets, are temporary, are just exercises, but occasionally, very occasionally, practice tablets are preserved, are found by archaeologists 4,000 years later. Show the mistakes, show the learning process, show us that scribal training was difficult, was demanding, was the years-long process that created the literate class that made Mesopotamian civilization function. Nabi Elishu's tablet won't survive, will be recycled, will become part of another tablet, will continue the cycle of clay being used and reused and used again, but what he learned will survive, will be carried forward, will be taught to the next generation, will preserve the king list, will ensure that the impossible reign lengths are copied correctly, are passed down, are maintained for the 1,000 years that Sumerian scribal tradition continues, for the additional 2,000 years before cuneiform dies completely. for the 4,000 years until archaeologists recover the tablets and translate them and wonder what these numbers mean. Nabi Elishu doesn't know he's preserving mysteries, doesn't know we'll ask questions about what he's copying, doesn't know the king list will become subject of scholarly debate, will be analysed and theorised and discussed in universities that won't exist for 4 millennia. He's just learning his craft, just doing the work, just pressing stylus into clay and creating the marks, just participating in the tradition, just becoming part of the transmission that connects his generation to the past and to the future, to us, sitting here, listening, wondering about the numbers he's copying, about the kings who ruled for 28,800 years, about what it meant, about whether they believed it, about how consciousness worked in a world where these numbers were accepted, were official, were what educated people knew. The gap between his understanding and ours is vast, is maybe too large to cross completely, but the tablets remain, the copies persist, the king list survives, and we can trace it back to moments like this, to boys like Nabi Elishu, to the patient work of learning to write, of copying the texts, of preserving the tradition, of making possible the mysteries we explore, the questions we ask, the wondering that connects us to them across 4,000 years of clay and cuneiform, and the impossible reigns of kings who ruled longer than any human has ever lived. Somewhere around 2600 BCE, somewhere in the progression of dynasties, somewhere in the patient documentation of king after king, something changes. The king list begins matching reality, begins corresponding to other sources, begins being verifiable through archaeology and through documents from other archives. The transition isn't sudden, isn't obvious, is gradual, is the slow convergence of mythology and history, of impossible and possible, of what memory claimed and what actually happened. The reign lengths are still exaggerated, are still longer than any human could live, but they're approaching plausibility, approaching the range where maybe, with generous interpretation, with the understanding that numbers were often inflated to honor great rulers, they could represent actual reigns, could be based on real chronology rather than mythological time. The third dynasty of is the clearest example. Begins around 2112 BCE, 5 kings ruling for a combined 108 years. The numbers are suddenly normal, suddenly historical, suddenly verifiable. The founder is Namu, rules for 18 years according to the king list. Other sources confirm this. Give same number, same sequence, same basic chronology. His son Shulgi follows, rules for 48 years. Again, other sources agree. The correlation is precise, is undeniable, is the proof that we've moved from mythology to history, from the list that documents impossible to the list that documents real. The transition is complete. The convergence is achieved. The king list has traced the path from when kingship descended from heaven through the flood, through the gradually normalizing reigns, to arrive finally at history, at the past we can trust, at the chronicle that functions as reliable source rather than mythological speculation. Perhaps the most remarkable thing is how the list handles this transition, doesn't acknowledge it, doesn't mark it, doesn't explain that earlier numbers were mythological and these are historical, just continues, just keeps listing kings and cities and reign lengths in the same format, in the same style, with the same authority. The implication is clear. This is all the same kind of information, all equally valid, all part of the chronicle. The impossible reigns of antediluvian kings and the verified reigns of historical kings are treated identically, are given equal status, are both recorded as fact, as what happened, as the official history of kingship, from its divine origins to the present moment when the list was written. The lack of distinction tells us something profound about how the Sumerians understood their past, about how mythology and history weren't separate categories for them, weren't different kinds of knowledge, were continuous, were part of same chronicle, same tradition, same story that stretched from creation to now. The historical kings are different though, are real in ways the mythological kings can't be. We can read their inscriptions, can visit their buildings, can trace their campaigns through documents, can see their impact on archaeology, can verify that they existed, that they ruled, that they did things that left traces. Shulgi of was remarkable ruler, was administrator, was reformer, was builder, left extensive inscriptions describing his achievements. The inscriptions match what the king list says about his reign length, match what other chronicles record, match what archaeology shows about the prosperity and expansion of during his rule. He's real, is historical, is the kind of king we can study with confidence rather than speculation. But in the king list, he's just another name, another reign, another link in the chain that stretches back to Alulem, back to the 800-year reign, back to the divine origins. Take a breath. Feel that continuity. The question becomes, where's the line? Where does mythology end and history begin? The king list doesn't tell us, doesn't mark the transition, forces us to figure it out, forces us to compare sources, to weigh evidence, to decide for ourselves which kings are real and which are legendary. Gilgamesh might be real, might be legendary, might be both. The kings between the flood and 2600 BCE, some might be historical, might preserve names of actual rulers, but with mythologized reigns, with numbers that oral tradition inflated, with chronology that's compressed or expanded or otherwise distorted. The earlier we go, the more uncertain we become. The antediluvian kings are mythology. That seems clear. The third dynasty of Ur is history. That's certain. But between them, that's the mystery. That's where mythology and history merge, where we can't quite separate them, where the king list is both and neither, where it functions as the bridge between mythological past and historical present, where it preserves something true, even while recording things that can't be literally true. Perhaps this is the document's genius, that it connects, that it creates continuity, that it makes present rulers heirs to divine origins without requiring belief that the divine origins were historical. The structure serves its purpose, legitimizes authority, proves antiquity, creates the genealogy that kingship requires. Whether every name is historical, whether every reign length is accurate, that's secondary. What matters is the chain, the connection, the unbroken line from heaven to now, from the first king to the current king, from divine origins to present authority. The king list provides that, makes it visible, makes it official, makes it the chronicle that every educated person knows, that scribal students memorize, that validates the political order, that makes kingship not just human institution but divine mandate, cosmic pattern. The way things are supposed to be because the way things have always been, from when kingship first descended from heaven, through the flood, through the dynasties, through the impossible reigns, and the gradually possible reigns, and the finally historical reigns, all part of same story, same tradition, same chronicle, that the king list preserves with its patient listing of kings and cities and numbers, some impossible, some possible, some verified, all recorded with equal authority, all part of the official history, all pressed into clay by scribes who believed or accepted or didn't question, who copied faithfully, who passed forward the tradition that connects their world to ours, that gives us the gift of the mystery, of the impossible numbers, of the question that doesn't resolve, that invites wondering, that makes us ask what history means, what mythology preserves, what the boundary is between them, and whether the boundary even exists, or is our modern imposition, our anachronistic attempt to separate what they kept unified, what they understood as continuous, what the king list presents as single chronicle, stretching from mythological origins to historical present, with kingship as the thread connecting everything, making everything part of same pattern, same story, same tradition, same mystery that waits in the clay tablets, in the cuneiform marks, in the numbers that are impossible but preserved, that are mythological but recorded as history, that are the legacy they left us, that are the hidden dimensions we're just beginning to explore. Beneath the surface of the king list, hidden in the impossible numbers, lies mathematics. Precision, pattern. The reign lengths aren't random, aren't arbitrary exaggerations, are calculated, are multiples of specific numbers that mattered to the Sumerians, that held significance, that connected mathematics to theology in ways we're still trying to understand. When you examine the antediluvian reigns closely, when you look at the actual numbers pressed into clay, you see system, see structure, see the hand of someone who understood mathematics, who was working within framework, who chose these specific numbers for specific reasons that made sense within their worldview, even if they mystify ours. The Sumerian number system was sexagesimal, base 60, the same system we still use for time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. The Sumerians invented this, developed it, used it for all their calculations. The choice of base 60 is interesting, is practical in some ways. 60 is highly divisible, can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, 60. The divisibility makes calculations easier, makes fractions simpler, makes the system elegant for commerce and administration, and the kind of complex accounting that civilization requires. But perhaps there's more. Perhaps 60 had sacred significance. Perhaps the number itself was divine, was connected to cosmic patterns, was the mathematics of heaven. The key number in the king list is 3600, called a shah in Sumerian. This is 60 squared, is the fundamental large unit in their number system, and every antediluvian reign is multiple of Shah. Alulim rules for 28,800 years, that's 8 Shah. And Menluana rules for 43,200 years, that's 12 Shah. Dumuzid rules for 36,000 years, that's 10 Shah. The pattern is perfect, is consistent, is showing that these numbers weren't pulled from air, were calculated, were chosen according to system, were expressing something, some meaning, some significance that we can recognize mathematically, even if we don't understand theologically. The precision suggests intentionality, suggests the king list's creators knew exactly what they were doing, were working within framework, were using mathematics to express ideas that weren't primarily mathematical. Perhaps the Shah represents something other than years. This is one of the oldest theories, one of the attempts to make the numbers work. If Shah doesn't mean 3,600 years, but means something else, dynasty, generation, some other unit of time, then maybe the numbers become plausible. Alulim's 8 Shah could be 8 generations, could be 8 ruling families, could be compressed tribal memory, where many rulers become one name. The theory is appealing, is logical, but it doesn't quite work. 8 generations is still only about 200 years. 8 dynasties could be longer, but would require different interpretation for each king. The mathematics creates new problems while solving old ones, and the texts themselves treat the numbers as actual reign lengths. Don't suggest alternative interpretations. Don't hint that Shah means anything other than the normal large number. The mystery remains. Take a breath here. Let the mathematics settle. Another possibility is astronomical. The Mesopotamians were sophisticated astronomers, tracked celestial movements carefully, developed accurate calendars, predicted eclipses. The number 3,600 might have astronomical significance, might relate to celestial cycles, to the movement of planets or stars, or the precession of equinoxes. The precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, creates a cycle of about 25,920 years. Divide that by various numbers, and you get values close to some of the king list reigns. The connection is tantalizing, is suggestive, is the kind of thing that makes you wonder if the ancient scribes were encoding astronomical knowledge, were preserving celestial observations in the guise of king chronicles, were using the list as mnemonic device, as way to record and transmit scientific knowledge disguised as history. But this theory requires assumptions, requires believing the Mesopotamians were deliberately obscure, were hiding knowledge, were encoding rather than recording. The texts don't support this, present themselves straightforwardly as chronicles, as political history, as documentation of kingship. Reading them as encoded astronomy imposes our interpretation, our categories, our desire to find scientific knowledge in ancient sources because scientific knowledge is what we value. Perhaps they were just recording what they believed, what their oral traditions preserved, what their understanding of deep time looked like when translated from memory to writing. Perhaps the mathematics is incidental, is just how Sumerian numbers work, is the natural outcome of using base 60 system for everything including mythological reign lengths. The silence of the tablets is complete. They don't explain themselves, don't tell us what the numbers mean, don't clarify whether Shah is years or something else, don't reveal whether astronomical knowledge is encoded, don't bridge the gap between their understanding and ours, just present the numbers, just list the reigns, just document the kings with mathematical precision that creates mystery rather than solving it. The hidden dimension is that we don't know what's hidden, don't know if there's secret meaning or if the meaning is exactly what appears on surface, don't know if we're missing something profound or seeing everything there is to see. The mathematics is precise, is undeniable, is creating patterns we can recognize. But what those patterns meant, what they were trying to express, that remains elusive, remains the mystery that numbers alone can't solve, that requires understanding consciousness, understanding how the Sumerians thought about time and kingship and the relationship between mathematics and theology, understanding things that clay tablets preserve imperfectly, that might be lost irretrievably, that might require accepting that some questions don't have answers, that some mysteries endure, that some ancient knowledge is genuinely hidden, not encoded, not secret, just lost, just separated from us by 4,000 years, and the gulf between their worldview and ours, between their mathematics and our mathematics, between what numbers meant to them and what numbers mean to us. The Shah waits in the tablets, patient, silent, significant, mysterious, the number that unlocks nothing and everything, that shows us the precision without showing us the purpose, that preserves the mathematics without preserving the meaning, that makes the king list both more comprehensible and more mysterious, both clear and obscure, both accessible and hidden. both mathematical and mythological, both precise and impossible. The hidden dimension that mathematics reveals is that mathematics isn't enough, that numbers alone don't explain, that precision can coexist with mystery, that the king list's calculations are perfect, but the calculations only deepen the questions rather than answering them. Hidden beneath the historical surface, buried in the structure of the king list, lies political necessity. The document isn't neutral chronicle, isn't objective history, is political tool, is instrument of legitimacy, is the way kings justify their authority by connecting themselves to divine origins, by proving their rule is part of ancient pattern, by showing unbroken chain from when kingship first descended from heaven to the present moment when they sit on throne. The king list serves power, serves the state, serves the eternal need of rulers to prove they should rule, that their authority is legitimate, that rebellion against them is rebellion against cosmic order, against the way things have always been, against the pattern that God's established. The impossible numbers aren't problem for this purpose. Our advantage: make the origins more distant, more sacred, more unquestionably divine. Imagine being king of around 2100 BCE. Your dynasty has just seized power, has unified the region, has established the third dynasty. You need to prove legitimacy, need to show you're not just successful general, not just fortunate politician, but rightful heir, part of tradition, connected to the long history of kingship that stretches back through dynasties and cities and the flood and the antediluvian rulers and ultimately to heaven itself, where kingship originated, where it was created by gods, where it was lowered as gift to humanity. You commission the king list, you have scribes compile it, gather the traditions, record the dynasties, create the chronicle that shows, look, here's the sequence, here's how kingship passed from city to city, and now it's here, in in your dynasty, in you. You're not usurper, our heir, are the current manifestation of ancient pattern, are as legitimate as Alulim, as Gilgamesh, as all the kings who came before. The list proves it, documents it, makes it official, makes it unchallengeable. The competition between cities was constant, was defining feature of Mesopotamian politics. Uruk claimed kingship, Kish claimed kingship, Uruk claimed kingship. Each city had its own traditions, its own version of history, its own understanding of when it held dominance. The king list reconciles these, creates single narrative, shows how kingship moved, was in Eridu, then Kish, then Uruk, then back to Kish, then Uwar, then Awar, then Hamazi, then back to Uruk. The movement is documented, is made part of official history, is shown to be natural pattern, expected pattern. The way kingship works, it moves, circulates, returns, and wherever it is, that city is legitimate center, is where authority resides, is where gods have chosen to place their mandate. The other cities must acknowledge this, must accept that currently kingship is elsewhere, but the list also shows hope, shows that kingship returns, that dominance isn't permanent, that patient cities can wait for their turn, can prepare for the moment when kingship descends to them again. Perhaps the most brilliant political aspect is the inclusion of impossible numbers, the antediluvian reigns of 28,800 years, of 43,200 years. These make the origins untouchable, make them so ancient, so distant, so clearly divine that no one can question them. No rival city can claim earlier foundation, can assert older legitimacy, can trace kingship further back. The impossible numbers create barrier, create beginning that's absolute, that's mythological, that's beyond historical investigation, beyond political manipulation, beyond the realm where evidence matters. The more ancient the origins, the more impossible the numbers, the stronger the legitimacy, the more unchallengeable the authority, the more certain that current rulers are heirs to something sacred, something divine, something that began in heaven and descended to earth and has continued unbroken for longer than anyone can imagine, for 241,200 years before the flood, for thousands more since, for the entire span of human civilization. The impossible numbers are the foundation, are the bedrock of legitimacy, are what makes the king list work politically. Take a breath. Feel that power. Other cultures use similar strategies. The Bible traces lineage back to Adam, to creation, to divine origins. The genealogies in Genesis include impossible lifespans: Methuselah living 969 years, Adam living 930 years. The pattern is the same, is the use of impossible numbers to create sacred antiquity, to make the genealogy reach back to divine beginning, to prove current people, current authority, current religious tradition, is heir to something ancient, something established by God, something that can't be questioned because the origins are too distant, too sacred, too clearly beyond human manipulation. Egyptian king lists do this too. Stretch back into mythological time, include gods ruling before humans, include reigns measured in thousands of years. The pattern is universal, is human, is the political use of mythology to create legitimacy, to justify authority, to make hierarchy seem natural, inevitable, divine. The king list's political function doesn't make it false exactly, makes it constructed, makes it purposeful, makes it tools serving specific needs, the needs of kingship, of state formation, of the rulers who needed to prove their right to rule, who needed chronicles showing continuity, showing connection to divine origins, showing that their power was part of cosmic pattern rather than recent seizure. The document served these needs perfectly, provided the chronicle, provided the genealogy, provided the legitimacy, and in doing so, preserved information, preserved names, preserved sequence, preserved the structure of early Mesopotamian politics, even while distorting the chronology. The political purpose doesn't negate historical value, just means we must read carefully, must understand what the document was trying to do, must separate what serves political needs from what preserves actual history, must recognize that the two are intertwined, that political documents can contain historical truth, that propaganda can preserve real information, that the king list is both and neither, and something more complex than either category alone can capture. The hidden political dimension is visible once you look for it, is obvious once you ask, who benefits from this document? Who commissioned it? Who needed it? Who used it? The answers reveal that the king list wasn't created in vacuum, wasn't neutral scholarly exercise, was produced within political context, served political purposes, legitimized specific dynasties, justified specific claims to authority. The impossible numbers weren't mistakes, were features, were the parts that made the document work politically, that made it valuable, that made it worth copying and preserving for 1,000 years. The king list succeeded politically, provided legitimacy, shaped how Mesopotamians understood kingship, how they accepted authority, how they related to their rulers, and in succeeding politically, it preserved mysteries, preserved the impossible numbers, preserved the chronicle that doesn't quite make sense, that serves power while creating puzzles, that legitimizes authority while raising questions, that works perfectly for its intended purpose, while mystifying everyone who reads it 4,000 years later, asking different questions, seeking different truths, looking for history rather than legitimacy, looking for facts rather than political theology, looking for what actually happened rather than what needed to be believed. The hidden dimension is that the document never intended to answer our questions, intended to answer theirs, and their questions were about authority, about legitimacy, about divine right, about proving that current rulers should rule, that kingship is cosmic pattern, that authority flows from heaven, that the impossible numbers prove the divine origins, that the chronicle connects present to sacred past, that political power is theological truth, that the king list is both history and mythology and political document and sacred text, and all of these simultaneously without contradiction, without tension, without the need to separate that we feel, that we impose. That makes the king list mysterious to us, while it made perfect sense to them. The hidden dimension is that they saw unity where we see contradiction, saw single truth where we see multiple genres, saw the king list as exactly what it claimed to be, chronicle of kingship from heaven to now, from impossible to possible, from divine to human, from sacred origins to political present, all true, all real, all part of same story, same tradition, same legitimacy that the document preserves and creates and serves. Hidden in the careful cuneiform marks, buried in the patient copying that preserved the king list across centuries, lies a question we may never answer. What did they believe? The scribes who pressed these numbers into clay, the students who memorized them, the teachers who transmitted them, the officials who consulted them, the kings who commissioned them. Did they think the numbers were literally true? Did they believe Alulim actually ruled for 28,800 years? Did they imagine Gilgamesh living 126 years? Or did they understand something we don't? Did they have categories we lack? Did they think about truth differently than we do? Did literal and metaphorical mean the same thing to them? Or did those distinctions not exist, not matter, not organize knowledge the way they do for us? Perhaps the answer is, they believed and didn't believe simultaneously. This seems contradictory, seems impossible. But consider religious belief in any culture. People hold literal and metaphorical truths together, accept that scripture is true in multiple senses, that sacred narratives work on different levels, that you can believe Adam lived 930 years in sacred time, while knowing that humans don't live 930 years in ordinary time, that Noah's flood can be cosmically true, while not being geologically verifiable. That truth has dimensions, has layers, has ways of being true that aren't about factual accuracy, but about meaning, about significance, about the truths that matter more than facts. The Sumerians might have thought this way, might have had no trouble accepting that antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years in mythological time, while knowing that current kings ruled for decades in ordinary time. The times were different, the categories were different, the rules were different. Mythological time and historical time weren't the same thing, weren't measured the same way, weren't subject to same limitations. The concept of sacred time is ancient, is cross-cultural, is the understanding that ritual creates different temporality, that when you enter temple, or perform ceremony, or recite sacred text, you're entering different kind of time, time that connects to origins, to creation, to the mythological events that established reality. Sacred time is cyclical, is eternal return, is the time when gods acted and continue acting, is different from profane time, the linear time of daily life where things happen once and don't repeat, where cause follows effect, where change is irreversible. Perhaps the king list operates in sacred time, records the mythological reigns in sacred temporality, where 28,800 years is meaningful number, is expression of divinity, is the reign length appropriate for kings who were closer to gods, who ruled in the age when heaven and earth were united, when boundaries were fluid, when impossible was possible, and then at some point, perhaps the flood, the time changes, becomes profane, becomes linear, becomes the ordinary time where kings rule for normal lifespans and die, and are succeeded by sons who also die. The king list documents the transition, documents the shift from sacred to profane, from mythological to historical, from time measured in shah to time measured in years. Perhaps the scribes simply accepted authority, accepted tradition, didn't question what they were told to copy. Scribal training was about faithfulness, about precision, about reproducing texts exactly, not about critical thinking, not about questioning whether the content made sense. The master copy said Alulim ruled 28,800 years, so that's what you wrote, that's what you memorized, that's what you passed forward. The question of whether it was literally true might not have occurred to you, might have been irrelevant, might have been beside the point. Your job was preservation, was transmission, was ensuring the tradition continued unbroken, was being faithful to what had been passed down. Whether the numbers corresponded to actual years, that wasn't your concern, wasn't your authority, wasn't what scribal craft was about. You copied, you preserved, you maintained the text. The meaning was for others, for priests perhaps, for scholars, for the wise who understood the deeper significance. Your role was simpler, was more focused, was the crucial task of keeping the tradition alive, of ensuring the king list survived, of making the next copy, of teaching the next generation, of being the link in chain that connected past to future. Take a breath here. Rest with that uncertainty. Modern parallels might help. Consider how modern people relate to their religious texts. Ask a Christian if they believe Methuselah lived 969 years. You'll get various answers. Some say yes, absolutely, literally. Some say it's metaphorical. Some say it's different kind of truth. Some say they don't know but accept it as scripture. Some say it doesn't matter to their faith. The diversity of responses shows that belief is complex, is layered, isn't simple binary of believe or don't believe. Perhaps ancient Mesopotamians were similar. Perhaps some believed literally, some metaphorically, some didn't think about it, some accepted without analyzing, some questioned privately but affirmed publicly, some understood the political function and participated in the fiction. Some genuinely thought the numbers were accurate. Some knew they were symbolic but valued them anyway. The diversity of belief is normal, is human, is what happens in any culture with any text that's been around long enough to accumulate multiple interpretations. What we can say with confidence is this: the numbers mattered enough to preserve carefully, mattered enough to copy repeatedly, mattered enough to transmit across 1,000 years, mattered enough to be taught in scribal schools, mattered enough to consult when establishing chronology, mattered enough to be the official version, the standard chronicle, the accepted history. Whether they mattered because they were believed literally or because they served important symbolic function, that's the question. That's the mystery. That's what we can't recover from clay tablets alone, can't determine from cuneiform marks, can't excavate from ruins or analyze in museums, can only wonder about, can only speculate, can only approach with humility and the recognition that consciousness changes, that how people think about truth and belief and the relationship between mythology and history has varied across cultures and eras, that our categories might not be their categories, that our questions might not be their questions, that the way we separate literal from metaphorical might not be how they separated, if they separated at all. The silence of the scribes is total. They recorded, they preserved, they transmitted, but they didn't explain, didn't tell us what they believed, didn't leave commentaries saying, here's what these numbers mean, or here's how to interpret this. Just copied, just maintained the tradition, just pressed the marks into clay with the same care, whether the number was 28,800 years or 48 years, whether the king was mythological or historical, whether the reign was impossible or verified. The same care, the same precision, the same dedication to accuracy that preserved the text but not the consciousness that created it, that gives us the king list but not the understanding, that preserves the mystery perfectly, completely, with such thoroughness that we can read every word and still not grasp what it meant to those who wrote it, what it meant to believe it, what it meant to copy it, what it meant to copy it, what it meant to live in a world where these numbers were the official history, where impossibility was documented as fact, where mythology and history merged seamlessly, where the king list was both and neither, and exactly what it claimed to be, chronicle of kingship. From heaven to now, from when to when, the hidden dimension is that we're looking for what they might not have hidden, what might have been obvious to them, what might have required no explanation because everyone understood, because the framework was shared, because the consciousness was unified, because they saw what we can't see, understood what we can't understand, believed what we can't believe, or believed differently, or didn't use belief the way we use it, or had relationship to truth that we've lost. That clay can't preserve, that cuneiform can't capture, that remains hidden, not because it was secret, but because it was so obvious it needed no recording, so fundamental it required no explanation, so basic to their consciousness that preserving it would have seemed as unnecessary as preserving the fact that the sky is up and the earth is down. Some things are too obvious to document, and sometimes those are exactly the things that later cultures can't recover, can't reconstruct, can't access except through fragments and speculation and the patient wondering about what it meant, what they believed, what the numbers signified, what the king list was, what truth it preserved, what mysteries it created, what it means, what it meant, what it will mean. The silence is complete. The mystery endures, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some things should remain hidden, should resist interpretation, should preserve the distance between their world and ours, between their truth and our truth, between the impossible numbers they recorded and the questions we ask about them. The question that echoes through every translation, every analysis, every careful study of the king list is this: what are these numbers? Some scholars believe the answer is straightforward but not simple. The impossible reign lengths are compressed genealogies, are oral traditions' way of preserving deep time, are what happens when pre-literate cultures try to remember origins, try to trace lineage back through centuries, back through the generations that blur into mythological time. The theory is called genealogical compression, is well documented in oral cultures, is the natural outcome of memory, trying to do what memory can't quite do, can't preserve precise chronology across many generations, can compress, can condense, can turn many rulers into few names, can turn centuries into single reigns that grow longer with each retelling until they become the impossible numbers we see in the king list. Consider how oral tradition works. You remember your grandfather, maybe your great-grandfather, perhaps one generation before that, if someone told you stories, but beyond that, the past becomes hazy. Names might be preserved, might be passed down, but how many generations? How long ago? That becomes uncertain, becomes approximate, becomes many generations ago, or in the time of the ancestors, or when the founders came. The specificity is lost. The chronology is compressed. 3 generations of leaders might become one legendary founder. A dynasty lasting a century might become a single king with a very long reign. The process is natural, is how memory works when it's not supported by writing, when it depends entirely on what people can remember and pass down and teach to children who will teach to their children who will remember something, but not everything. Not precisely, not with the accuracy that creates reliable chronology. Perhaps the antediluvian kings represent this compression at maximum, represent the deepest memories, the most ancient genealogies, the tribal origins from the very beginning of Sumerian culture. If Sumerian identity formed over centuries, over 1,000 years perhaps, As various groups merged and mixed and created the culture that eventually built cities, then the oral traditions would preserve names, would preserve the sense of sequence, would remember that this leader came before that leader, that the kingship moved from this clan to that clan, but the timeline, that would compress, that would blur, that would become the mythological numbers. 8 kings might represent 8 major tribal groups, 8 founding clans, 8 lineages that contributed to Sumerian identity, and the 241,200 combined years might represent what? Maybe just a very long time, maybe since the beginning, maybe as long as we can remember. The numbers are meaningful, are expressing something real, but aren't meant to be taken as actual year counts, are symbolic, are the way oral tradition expresses deep antiquity, are what you get when you finally write down oral genealogies that have been transmitted for centuries. Some scholars point to other cultures, other king lists, other ancient chronicles that show similar patterns. The biblical genealogies in Genesis list patriarchs with impossible lifespans: Adam, 930 years, Seth, 912 years, Enosh, 905 years. The pattern looks familiar, looks like what the king list does. The numbers are impossibly long, but gradually decrease as you approach verifiable history. The parallel suggests similar process, suggests oral tradition being written down, suggests genealogical compression, suggests that ancient cultures across the world face the same problem. How do you document origins when you have no written records? When you're trying to trace lineage back through centuries of oral transmission? The answer seems to be, you give the early figures very long lifespans, very long reigns. You make the numbers reflect the depth of time, the weight of antiquity, the sense that these origins are ancient beyond normal reckoning. Take a breath here. Consider this possibility. Another interpretation focuses on institutional continuity rather than individuals. Perhaps the king list isn't recording individual lifespans at all. Perhaps it's recording the duration of dynasties, of ruling families, of institutional power. When it says Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, perhaps it means the Alulim dynasty ruled for some period. Perhaps the name represents lineage rather than person, represents clan rather than individual. This would explain why the numbers are so large, why they're multiples of 3,600, why they have mathematical precision, because they're not trying to be lifespans, are measuring something else, something institutional, something that lasts longer than individuals. The theory is appealing, is logical, but requires reading the text against its apparent meaning. The king list presents these as individual reigns, as kings, as successors, not as dynasties, not as institutions. Reading it differently requires assuming the Sumerians were being deliberately obscure. We're using one word to mean another. We're encoding rather than documenting. Possible, but unprovable. Others suggest the measurement system changed. That year meant something different in early times, that the Sumerians used different calendars, different ways of counting time, that what we translate as year might have been lunar month, or season, or some other unit. If you divide the antediluvian reigns by 12, converting years to months, you get smaller numbers. Alulim's 28,800 becomes 2,400. Still impossible, still beyond human lifespan, but less impossibly so. The theory tries to solve the problem mathematically, tries to find conversion factor that makes the numbers work, but no conversion succeeds. No system makes the numbers fully plausible, and other evidence suggests the Sumerians did use years similar to ours, did have solar calendar, did count time in ways we can understand. The measurement system doesn't seem to be the problem. The numbers are the problem, and the numbers resist simple solutions. Perhaps the most honest scholarly position is agnostic, is saying, we don't know, can't know with certainty. The king list is a unique document, doesn't have parallels detailed enough to provide clear comparison, doesn't come with explanatory texts, doesn't include commentary from ancient scholars telling us what they thought these numbers meant. We can analyze, can theorize, can compare to other cultures, can apply our understanding of oral tradition and political legitimacy and religious thought, but we can't definitively say what the Sumerians intended, what they believed, what these numbers meant within their worldview. The mystery is genuine, is perhaps permanent, is the kind that clay tablets preserve perfectly, while denying us the consciousness that would make interpretation certain. The skeptical view is valuable, provides framework, provides possible explanations, but can't eliminate mystery, can't close the question, can't make the impossible numbers fully comprehensible, can only make them less inexplicable, only provide context, only suggest how they might have arisen, how they might have functioned, how they might have made sense to people whose consciousness we can't fully access, whose categories we can't fully reconstruct, whose relationship to time and truth and history was different from ours in ways that resist complete translation. The king list endures, the numbers persist, and the skeptical theories, however valuable, however well-reasoned, remain theories, remain possibilities, remain our best attempts to understand what might ultimately resist full understanding, what might remain mysterious despite our analysis, despite our frameworks, despite our careful scholarly attention. The mystery is real, is profound, is the gap between their world and ours that 4,000 years and the death of their civilization creates and preserves, creates and makes permanent, creates and ensures that some questions, however much we ask them, however carefully we study, remain questions, remain open, remain the enduring mysteries that connect us to the ancient world, not through answers, but through shared wondering, through the recognition that some things are lost, some knowledge is irretrievable, some mysteries endure. The question remains for others: what if we're missing something? What if the skeptical explanations, however reasonable, miss a dimension? What if the Sumerians weren't just compressing genealogies, or using different time measurements, or recording dynasties? What if they knew something, preserved something, remembered something that we've lost? Some researchers suggest the king list might encode knowledge, might preserve information about the deep past, about catastrophes, about civilizations, about human history that archaeology hasn't fully recovered. The ideas are speculative, are controversial, are on the margins of mainstream scholarship, but they're worth considering, worth wondering about, worth holding as possibilities, even while acknowledging they're unprovable. Perhaps they're wrong, but perhaps dismissing them too quickly closes doors that should stay open. Perhaps mystery requires humility, requires admitting that our frameworks might be incomplete, that ancient peoples might have known things we don't, that the past might be stranger than our categories allow. One theory focuses on catastrophism, on the idea that human history includes catastrophic events that disrupted civilization, that created breaks, that caused resets. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that around 10,900 BCE, a comet or asteroid impact created sudden climate change, created the Younger Dryas cold period, disrupted the emerging agricultural revolution, possibly destroyed early settlements, possibly reset human development. If this happened, if there were earlier attempts at civilization that were destroyed, might oral traditions preserve memory? Might the antediluvian kings represent cultures that existed before the catastrophe, before the flood that the king list describes? The flood might not be local Mesopotamian flooding, might be memory of global catastrophe, of the end of the Ice Age, of rising seas that drowned coastlines, of climate chaos that destroyed the old world. The theory is speculative, requires believing oral tradition can preserve accurate memories across 10,000 years, requires believing the king list is that old, is preserving something from the very dawn of civilization, possible, but extraordinary. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which this theory lacks. Others point to astronomical knowledge, suggest the king list might encode precessional data, might preserve observations of the slow wobble of Earth's axis. The precession takes about 25,920 years for a full cycle. The antediluvian rains, when you add them and manipulate them in various ways, produce numbers close to precessional periods, close to zodiacal ages, close to the cycles that ancient astronomers might have tracked. If the Mesopotamians understood precession, and there's some evidence they did, they might have encoded this knowledge, might have used the king list as mnemonic device, as way to preserve astronomical observations in memorable form. The theory is intriguing, shows sophisticated mathematical analysis, but requires assuming the king list is deliberately obscure, is hiding knowledge, is being written in code. The text doesn't suggest this, presents itself straightforwardly, doesn't hint at hidden meanings, doesn't include the kind of numerical puzzles that would indicate encoding. The astronomical interpretation imposes our desire for scientific knowledge onto ancient political document, might be seeing patterns that aren't intended, might be finding what we want to find rather than what's actually there. Perhaps the most mystical interpretation suggests the numbers are literally true, but in a way we don't understand. Perhaps human lifespans were different before the flood. Perhaps the antediluvian world had different conditions, different biology, different physics. Perhaps the laws of nature weren't the same. Perhaps the connection between heaven and earth was different. This is religious rather than scientific interpretation, is what some literal believers maintain, is taking the text at face value and saying, if it says 28,800 years, then it was 28,800 years. We don't understand how, don't understand why, but we accept it based on faith. based on belief that the text is true, even when it reports impossibilities. This interpretation is unfalsifiable, can't be disproven, but also can't be supported by evidence, requires stepping outside the framework of natural law, requires accepting miracle, requires faith, which some have and others don't. The interpretation exists, is held by believers, is part of the spectrum of how humans relate to ancient texts, but isn't accessible through archaeology, through historical analysis, through the methods that scholars use to understand the past. Take a breath. Hold these possibilities lightly. What's valuable about these alternative views isn't necessarily their accuracy, isn't whether they're right, is that they remind us of our limits, remind us that we don't know everything, that ancient peoples might have had knowledge we've lost, that consciousness might have worked differently, that the world might hold mysteries our frameworks can't capture. The skeptical position is probably correct. The king list probably does preserve compressed genealogies, probably does reflect oral traditions' limitations, probably does serve political purposes. But the probably matters, the uncertainty matters, the acknowledgement that we're working with incomplete information, interpreting across vast cultural distance, trying to understand consciousness that died with the civilization, that matters. The humility matters, the openness to mystery matters, because closing the question too confidently, declaring with certainty that we know what the king list is and what it isn't, that might foreclose possibilities, might prevent discoveries, might make us miss something that's actually there. We may never know if the Sumerians encoded astronomical knowledge, may never prove whether oral tradition preserves 10,000-year-old catastrophe memories, may never determine if some dimension of the king list escapes our understanding, but keeping the questions open, keeping the possibilities alive, that serves scholarship, serves wonder, serves the recognition that mystery is valuable, is productive, is invitation to continued investigation. The alternative views, even the speculative ones, even the ones that seem unlikely, they serve function. They keep us humble, keep us curious, keep us from thinking we've solved what might not be fully solvable. Keep the king list alive as mystery rather than closed case. Keep it interesting, keep it worthy of attention, keep it generating questions rather than just answers. Perhaps the deepest truth is that we need both. Need the skeptical rigor that prevents wild speculation, that grounds interpretation in evidence, that applies scholarly method, and need the mystical openness that recognizes limits, that acknowledges lost knowledge, that admits consciousness changes, that the past might contain surprises, that ancient peoples might have been more sophisticated than we credit, might have known things we're only rediscovering, might have had relationships to time and cosmos and history that we can't fully access through clay tablets and archaeological excavation. Both positions serve us, both are necessary, both keep the king list alive as object of wonder, as source of questions, as mystery that 4,000 years hasn't solved, that perhaps will never be fully solved, that perhaps shouldn't be fully solved, because perhaps mystery is the point. Perhaps the king list's greatest gift isn't the information it preserves, but the wondering it creates, the questions it raises, the humility it requires, the recognition that some things resist explanation, some ancient knowledge is genuinely lost, some mysteries endure, and that endurance, that persistence of the unknown, that's valuable, that's worth preserving, that's the legacy that matters, perhaps more than any specific interpretation, the legacy of wonder, of curiosity, of the recognition that the past is vast and complex and strange, and that 4,000 years is long enough to lose things, important things, things that might have mattered profoundly to the people who created the king list, who believed it, who copied it, who preserved it, who passed it forward until it reached us, reached our wondering, reached our attempts to understand, reached our theories and speculations and careful analyses and ultimate humble acknowledgement that despite everything we know, despite all we can say, despite the frameworks we've built, the king list remains mysterious, remains enigmatic, remains the question that keeps asking itself, that keeps inviting exploration, that keeps connecting us to the ancient world, through the shared experience of wondering what these numbers mean, what truth they preserve, what knowledge they encode, what mystery they embody, what they are, what they were, what they will be. The question continues. The mystery endures, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The civilization fell, as all civilizations do. Sumer faded into Akkad. Akkad gave way to Babylon. Babylon was conquered by Assyria. Assyria collapsed. The cities crumbled. The ziggurats eroded. The canals silted up. And eventually, the language died. Sumerian stopped being spoken, became liturgical language only, used in temples, but not in markets, not in homes, not in the living speech of daily life. then Akkadian faded too, then Babylonian, then Assyrian, the cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped marks that had documented civilization for 3,000 years, was abandoned, was replaced by alphabetic writing, by Aramaic script, by systems that were simpler, easier to learn, better suited to changing world. And when the script died, when the last scribe who could read cuneiform passed away, the king list became silent, became mysterious marks on clay, became unreadable, became lost. For over 2,000 years, the tablets lay buried, the tells accumulated over them. The wind and rain and time covered them with earth. The cities where they'd been written became mounds in the Iraqi landscape, unmarked, unknown. The local people knew the mounds were ancient, knew they contained ruins, sometimes found bricks with strange marks, sometimes uncovered fragments, but couldn't read them, couldn't interpret them, couldn't access the knowledge they contained. The king list was waiting, was patient, was preserved by the dry climate and the protective earth, was holding its impossible numbers, its chronicle of kings, its mystery, waiting for the moment when someone would come who could read again, who could translate, who could bring the ancient voices back to life, who could make the Sumerians speak across the silence of millennia. The rediscovery began in the 19th century, when European archaeologists and adventurers became fascinated with Mesopotamia, with the land between the rivers, with the birthplace of civilization. They started excavating, started opening the tells, started finding tablets by the thousands. The cuneiform marks were recognized, were identified as writing, but no one could read them. Not at first. The decipherment took decades, required brilliant scholars working with multilingual inscriptions, working with Persian texts that included known languages, alongside cuneiform, working with patience and insight, and the kind of intellectual courage that decipherment requires. Gradually, the languages yielded. Sumerian was recovered, Akkadian followed, and the tablets began speaking, began revealing what they'd held silent for 2,000 years, began restoring voices, stories, chronicles, the king list among them. The first fragments found in Nippur in 1906 were puzzling, were confusing, were clearly important but difficult to interpret. More copies emerged over the decades. The Weld-Blundell prism in 1922, other versions in other cities. Each new find added details, added context, added pieces to the puzzle. Scholars began assembling the chronicle, began understanding its structure, began recognizing that this was the official Sumerian history, was how they understood their past, was document of profound importance, and began encountering the impossible numbers. The 28, 800-year reigns, the 43, 200-year reigns, the antediluvian kings who ruled longer than any human could possibly live. The initial reaction was dismissal, was assumption of error, but as more copies emerged, as the pattern became clear, the scholars had to accept this wasn't mistake, was intentional, was what the Sumerians actually recorded, actually believed, actually transmitted as their history. The mystery was born, or reborn, was the same mystery the ancient scribes lived with, just now transplanted to modern consciousness, to modern frameworks, to modern attempts to understand. Take a breath. Feel that connection. Even now, the tablets are studied, new translations appear, new interpretations emerge. The king list is taught in universities, is analysed in academic papers, is discussed in books about ancient history, is digitized and made available online, is more accessible now than it ever was in ancient times when you needed years of scribal training to read it. The democratization of knowledge means anyone can examine the king list, can read the translations, can form their own theories, can wonder about the numbers. The scholarly conversation continues to evolve, continues to produce new insights, new frameworks, new attempts to crack the mystery, to understand what the Sumerians meant, what they believed, what truth they were preserving in these impossible numbers. Still today, new discoveries are made. Not new king list tablets necessarily, though more fragments occasionally surface, but new context, new understanding of Sumerian culture, new archaeological evidence about how their society functioned, new linguistic insights about how their language worked, new comparative data from other cultures. Each new piece of information refines understanding, adds nuance, adds possibility. The king list doesn't exist in isolation, exists within a web of knowledge about ancient Mesopotamia that's constantly growing, constantly deepening, constantly revealing more about the world that created these chronicles, about the consciousness that accepted these numbers, about the purposes the list served, about the political and religious and cultural forces that shaped how the Sumerians understood their past. The research is ongoing. is never finished, is the continuous conversation that keeps ancient civilizations alive, that keeps their questions alive, that keeps us connected to them across the millennia. Still today, the king list influences modern culture in unexpected ways, appears in popular works, in theories about ancient civilizations, in speculations about lost knowledge, in the ongoing human fascination with origins and antiquity and the mysteries of the deep past. The impossible numbers capture imagination, invite speculation, create wonder. The king list has become more than ancient document, has become symbol, has become the embodiment of ancient mystery, of the questions that endure, of the recognition that the past holds things we don't understand, that ancient peoples might have known things we don't. That mystery is real, is permanent, is worthy of respect. The cultural influence extends beyond scholarship, extends into the realm of popular consciousness, where the king list represents something profound about human relationship to time, to history, to the deep past that shapes us but that we can't fully access. The stars that watched the first scribe press the king list into clay, those stars still shine, haven't changed. The same patterns, the same lights. The Sumerians used stars for navigation, for calendar, for connecting Earth to heaven. We use the same stars for different purposes, for astronomy, for space exploration, for understanding the cosmos through science rather than mythology. But the stars remain the constant, remain the witnesses to both their civilization and ours, to their understanding and ours, to the long arc of human attempts to make sense of time and authority and legitimacy and origins. The stars connect us, make us contemporaries across 4,000 years, make us fellow wanderers, fellow questioners, fellow humans trying to understand where we came from, how long we've been here, what our history means, what truth it preserves. Perhaps the deepest legacy is the question itself, the asking, the wondering whether the impossible numbers mean something, whether they preserve something, whether we can understand them, whether the mystery can be solved, or whether it's meant to endure. The king list teaches us that history is complex, is layered, is never just facts, is always interpretation, is always shaped by the consciousness that creates it and the consciousness that receives it. The document served the Sumerians, served their political needs, their religious needs, their need for legitimacy and continuity and connection to divine origins, and it serves us, serves our need for mystery, our need for connection to ancient world, our need to wonder, our need to ask questions that don't have easy answers, our need to face the limits of what we can know, what we can recover, what clay tablets can tell us across the silence of millennia and the death of the civilization that created them. The pattern repeats. Civilizations rise, create chronicles, document their histories, and fall, and the chronicles survive. Wait in the earth, wait for rediscovery, wait for new civilizations to find them, to translate them, to wonder about them, to make them part of new understanding. The cycle of remembering and forgetting is eternal, is human, is what makes archaeology possible, makes history possible, makes the king list possible. We remember them by forgetting them first, by losing the knowledge and then recovering it, by creating distance and then bridging it, by making them foreign and then making them familiar again. The Sumerians are more alive now than they were 100 years ago, are more accessible, are more studied, are more present in human consciousness. The rediscovery is still happening, is still unfolding, is still bringing them back to life, making them speak, making them matter, making their mysteries our mysteries, making their questions our questions, making their wonder our wonder, and you, listening now, you're part of this, part of the legacy, part of the chain that connects scribal student in Nippur 4,000 years ago to the scholars who excavated the tablets, to the translators who made them readable to this moment, this wondering, this exploration of impossible numbers and ancient consciousness and the mysteries that clay tablets preserve. You're carrying forward the tradition, the asking, the not knowing, the humble recognition that some things are lost, some knowledge is irretrievable, some mysteries endure. You're honoring the king list by wondering about it, by giving it your attention, by allowing it to create questions in your mind, by being present to the mystery, by accepting that 4,000 years is long enough to lose things, important things, things that mattered profoundly, but not long enough to lose everything, not long enough to make the wondering stop, not long enough to close the questions, not long enough to make the king list irrelevant, obsolete, finished. It continues in you, in your wondering, in your willingness to spend this time exploring ancient chronicle, considering impossible numbers, holding the mystery without demanding it resolve. The legacy is alive, is present, is happening now, in this moment, in this listening, in this connection across time that the king list makes possible, that the patient clay tablets enable, that the careful cuneiform marks preserve, the kings who ruled for 28,800 years, for 43,200 years, for 126 years, for 48 years, for the impossible spans and the historical spans and all the spans between. They ruled, or they were remembered as ruling, or they represent something we don't quite understand, and now they're here, with us, in this exploration, in this wondering, in this moment where ancient and modern meet, where their questions become our questions, where their mystery becomes our mystery, where the king list continues its work, its function, its purpose of connecting present to past, of proving that what was matters, that origins matter, that the deep time matters, that the impossible numbers matter, even when we can't explain them, even when they resist interpretation, even when 4,000 years and the death of a civilization separate us from the consciousness that created them. The legacy endures, the chronicle continues, and the wondering, the patient humble wondering about what it all means, that continues too, in you, in us, in everyone who encounters the king list and asks the question that has no answer, but that needs to be asked anyway, the question that makes us human, that connects us to the Sumerians, that proves that time doesn't erase everything, that some mysteries survive, that some questions endure, that the king list, with all its impossibilities, with all its mysteries, with all its resistance to easy interpretation, continues, still speaks, still matters, still invites, still connects, still preserves, still waits, patient as the clay it's written on, silent as the centuries between then and now, mysterious as the kings it records, impossible as the reigns it documents, real as the wonder it creates. The legacy is complete, is total, is you, here, now, listening, wondering, carrying forward. The tradition continues, and so we return. Back to this moment, back to wherever you are now, listening to this, feeling whatever supports you, back to the present, which is all we ever truly inhabit. The journey through the king list is complete. The impossible numbers have been explored, the theories have been considered, the mystery has been acknowledged, and here we are, still uncertain, still wondering, still holding the question without demanding it resolve into answer. The clay tablets rest in museums, in Oxford, in Philadelphia, in Istanbul, in the quiet, controlled environments that preserve ancient things. The cuneiform marks are still visible, still clear, still pressing their impossible numbers into anyone who looks. 28,800 years, 43,200 years, 126 years, 48 years. The progression from mythology to history, from impossible to possible, from the time when kingship descended from heaven to the time when kings were simply human, simply mortal, simply rulers who did their best and died and were succeeded by others who also died. The tablets don't explain themselves, don't clarify what the numbers mean, don't bridge the gap between Sumerian consciousness and ours. Just preserve, just wait, just continue their patient work of holding the mystery, of making it available, of ensuring that 4,000 years after the scribes pressed their styli into wet clay, we can still read, can still wonder, can still ask what they meant, what they believed, what truth they were preserving. We don't know, won't know, can't know with the certainty we'd prefer. The king list preserves its mystery perfectly, completely, with such thoroughness that translation doesn't eliminate it, that archaeological context doesn't resolve it, that scholarly analysis doesn't close it. The document is accessible, is readable, is understood in structure and sequence and political function, but the impossible numbers remain impossible, remain mysterious, remain the question that 4,000 years hasn't answered, that perhaps will never be fully answered, that perhaps shouldn't be answered because mystery has value, has purpose, has the gift of humility, has the invitation to wonder, has the recognition that some things are lost, some knowledge is irretrievable, some consciousness is separated from us by time and cultural distance too vast to completely bridge. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some things should remain hidden, should resist interpretation, should preserve the distance between ancient and modern, between their understanding and ours, between what they knew and what we can recover. The king list teaches us that history isn't just facts, isn't just dates and names and sequences we can verify, is also consciousness, is also belief, is also the frameworks through which people understood their world, and those frameworks, those ways of thinking, those relationships to time and truth and legitimacy, those can be lost even when the documents survive, can remain mysterious even when the language is translated, can resist full understanding even when we apply all our modern tools, all our analytical frameworks, all our comparative evidence. The mystery endures, and perhaps the endurance is the point. Perhaps what the King List preserves most perfectly isn't history but the recognition that the past is vast and strange, and that 4,000 years is long enough to lose things that mattered profoundly. Take a breath. Rest in that acceptance. The stars that watched Alulim, if he existed, those stars still shine. The same patterns, the same lights. The constellations have barely shifted in 4,000 years, are almost identical to what Sumerian astronomers observed, what they used for navigation and calendar, and the sense that cosmos had order, had pattern, had divine governance that earthly kingship reflected. We see the same stars and think differently. Think about fusion and light years and the physics of stellar evolution. Think scientifically where they thought theologically. But the stars remain the constant, remain the witnesses to both their wondering and ours, to their questions and our questions, to the long arc of human attempts to make sense of time, of origins, of legitimacy, of where we come from and how long we've been here, and what our history means. The stars connect us, make us contemporaries, make us fellow humans looking up and asking questions that the cosmos doesn't answer, questions that endure, questions that make us human. The wind moves across the Iraqi landscape, across the tells that cover ancient cities, across the places where Sumerians lived and worked and created the first civilization. The wind is indifferent, doesn't know about the kinglet, doesn't care about impossible rain lengths, doesn't distinguish between the mounds that cover Uruk and the mounds that cover Uruk, just moves, just continues its patient work of erosion, of weathering, of slowly returning everything to earth, to dust, to the undifferentiated matter that eventually claims all human creation. The wind has been moving for millions of years, will move for millions more, doesn't notice the brief 4,000 years between the King List's creation and now, doesn't mark the rise and fall of civilizations, just continues, just flows, just exists in the eternal present that geological processes inhabit, where human timescales are too brief to register, where even impossible rain lengths are just moments, just flickers, just the briefest interruption in the patient ongoing transformation of landscape that wind and water perform without consciousness, without purpose, without the need for meaning that humans impose on everything, that humans require. That makes us ask questions like, what do these numbers mean? Why did they record them? What were they trying to preserve? And somewhere in the stillness, in the quiet spaces between questions, in the acceptance that some mysteries endure, the King List continues its work, its function, its purpose of connecting, of preserving, of making us wonder. It's not just historical document, it's meditation on time, on memory, on how civilizations understand their origins, on how authority requires antiquity, on how mythology and history merge, on how consciousness changes, on how 4,000 years is long enough to lose understanding but not long enough to lose the document, not long enough to make the wondering stop, not long enough to close the questions. The King List waits, patient as clay, silent as the centuries, mysterious as the numbers it preserves. And in that waiting, in that silence, in that mystery, there's peace, there's acceptance, there's the recognition that not knowing is okay, is valuable, is the condition that makes wondering possible. That makes exploration meaningful. That makes this journey worthwhile. We didn't solve the mystery, can't solve it. Perhaps we'll never solve it, but we explored it, considered it, gave it our attention, honored it by wondering, by asking, by not demanding easy answers, by accepting that the impossible numbers remain impossible, remain mysterious, remain the gift that the Sumerians left us, the gift of wonder, of curiosity, of connection across time, of recognition that we're part of long tradition, long pattern, long story of humans trying to understand where we come from, how long we've been here, what our origins mean. The night deepens wherever you are, the clay tablets rest in their cases, the tells wait in the Iraqi landscape, the stars shine as they've always shone, and somewhere in all of that, in the patient ongoing existence of ancient things, in the continuity that connects their world to ours, in the silence that holds what language can't quite express, the King List remains, waits, preserves, the impossible, the mysterious, the question that endures, in stillness, in silence, in the deep, patient, endless time